All right, what's up, everyone? Today we are here for another Polymath online salon, this time on neuroplasticity and developmental cognition. And the purpose of this one is to get sort of into the bigger ideas of not just, in human brains, but in animal brains and other things that act like a nervous system or intelligent system, and to understand the way different systems are able to adapt and change. And why is it that neuroplasticity is something that we consider to be pretty powerful when an organism is younger versus when they're older? So I'll start with getting some intros from everyone. Kareem, you want to go first?
Oh, sure. My name is Kareem. I've attended some of the other hackathons and events at the FAU Sandbox before. I currently am a student of extension studies without a clear concentration yet. So I guess undecided.
You are at Harvard, right?
Correct. Harvard Extension School.
Afternoon. Nice to see everybody. My name is William Hahn, professor in the Center for Complex Systems and in the Mathematical Sciences Department here at Florida Atlantic University. And I help run the AI Sandbox in the Machine Perception and Cognitive Robotics Laboratory here.
And he's also going to be our co-host next week at Polymath Medical, along with Dan Elton, Kurt J. Mungle, Gil Blander will be coming. We got some cool people coming. All right. Cooper, if you're able to introduce yourself, or if you're busy, that's no worries.
No, I'm actually available with stars aligned. Thank you.
Perfect.
For the invite.
Yeah, we've been having an interesting conversation offline, so I'm excited.
Yes. I'm just Cooper. I'm academic adjacent into more cognitive hacking and all that sort of stuff with sensory substitution, those sorts of fields. And adjacently, the stuff this will be about, hopefully.
Yeah, my background is in mathematics and geometry. I'm a research coordinator at the Wolfram Institute. Michael Ostroff is one of our affiliate researchers there. And it's great to meet you all.
Like Dugan said, I'm affiliated researcher at the Wolfram Institute. I'm also a PhD physics student at FAU, and my main area and my main specialties are general relativity and complex systems.
Yeah, I'll just real quick. I am someone who's done a variety of things in industry and academia and startup stuff. I'm currently finishing a master's program in data science, but I've done some academic adjacent things in cognitive science, research, history of science, philosophy, stuff like that. And I met Addie at some other things in Boston with Dan, and I really like where we're going. And finally attended a real salon last time for the full length. It was a great time. So nice to be here and see everybody. So thanks.
Yeah, you did a really good job contributing to the last salon. That was pretty great.
What's up, guys? I'm Alif. I research some interesting new post deep learning neural network methods, and I also do full stack software engineering. So
you're a bit of a polymath, though, Alif. You've got quite a lot of ideas and skills under your belt.
Currently studying optoelectronics because some new hardware methods are more like neuromorphic hardware is where my interests are sort of converging towards. So
all right, cool. All right, so now that we've kind of gotten the intros out of the way, we can maybe get started on something. So yeah, basically this one is focused on developmental cognition and neuroplasticity. And I guess the first question that I would put out there is, why are things plastic earlier in life rather than later in life, at least of biological organisms that we can tell?
The dendritic spines, that a lot of pruning happens during aging.
And why does it happen during aging?
Well, they claim it's for optimization, but a lot of things being pruned are capable of processing data as well.
Have we found any sort of, just to throw a wrench into this, right? Have we found anything about there's greater plasticity in something in the body later on in life?
Perhaps. There are ways to get that, I know.
Yeah.
Although there could be just multiple routes to the same outcome as well. Different types of plasticity, so to speak.
Yeah, but the other thing that I think about it, right, is you don't, I think I think a lot of people are sort of chasing after this idea of neuroplasticity, right? Just plasticity of a mind in general. And it's like, you don't technically want something to be too plastic, right? You need to have something sort of there. Like, if something is too plastic, it doesn't usually, you need a little bit of structure to things. And what I mean by that is like, you've heard of the saying that like, if you keep your mind open, but not like so far out that it kind of falls out type of thing. Right. And I think there is a thing where it's like, if you sort of are able to, if you're able to see everything, what are you seeing? Right. And I think when people relate that to plasticity, I think people get the idea that lets them do more. Right. Because I'm a fan. Okay. I'm a fan of neuroplasticity. I'm interested in achieving what we think of as neuroplasticity, but I also want to focus on the ways in which neuroplasticity could maybe be a negative thing. Right. I'm curious if Mr. has any
something that I
beliefs.
just want to bring up, like, so like you're asking like later in life, like,
Yeah.
is there plastic, like traumatic brain injury? If you have some horrible thing happen to you and you lose some functionality and gain functionality, and you have rerouting of your circuits,
Right.
your neural circuits to be able to do that again, like in movement, that kind of stuff. But I mean, unless there's a reason, I think usually people crystallize their circuits as they get older.
I would say that's why it depends on the type of plasticity, because obviously there's the type to be able to learn and adapt to changes in physiology, because the mind will do that at any stages in life. Like you can learn a language at any stage, but there's something unique to when you're younger, you can learn it more rapidly. There's something to do with childhood type plasticity, that there's a more rapid ingest of information, I would say.
What do we know about savant syndrome? Because I'm always just kind of really fascinated by it, the fact that seems like it's a real possible thing, right? And so I think there's people that are born with some type of savant capability, but then there's also people that undergo like a head injury, they get knocked in the head a certain way, and if it's in this way in these conditions just enough, you sort of eventually wake up and find yourself with some type of very, very intense memory capability or something like that, or calculation ability. And I would be very interested in how can you induce this in neurotypicals, right? Without any, I already know about Jason Padgett. Yes. He was in like Seattle, Tacoma, Washington, something like that, and got knocked over the head at a bar or something. We should get him on one of these salons to hear from him firsthand. That would be kind of cool. But it's interesting that you can just, it seems that, if you knock the brain a certain way, all of a sudden the brain seems to reinterpret the way it's viewing the world into some capacity. What's the link that you just sent, Cooper? Because I'm trying to pull it up.
That's to a older study by Snyder, which I'm not a neuroscientist, so I can't vet the validity of such things, but it seems to be about inducing certain types
I remember
of
this. Was this the one talking about for drawing as well?
Yes, I think so.
Right.
Or like details orientation,
right,
and then pattern recognition.
Because I remember thinking about at least like savant, like very good sort of drawing ability or whatever, right? So there's a thing people will say when you're doing art and visual arts in general, right? So if you're drawing or painting, they'll say, well, you should draw what you see and not what you think. And so if you're trying to draw a face, what they'll do is they'll make you flip it down, right? You'll flip it around, rotate it, and then try to just, because that takes away from your abstraction of a face or something, you're better to easily focus on, say, the sensory, information that doesn't yet have that kind of abstraction overlaid on it. And so then you draw it and then you flip it back around and you're like, oh, well, maybe this actually kind of looks better. And I think that's a learnable skill that I think people have this to degrees naturally anyways, but you can bring it out a bit more. And I do wonder what, we have sort of the current and reported and somewhat understood cases of savant syndrome. What I'm interested in is what are the ones that are possible that we don't know about yet, or the ones that have happened somewhere and they just weren't really reported on, right? There is I think we have some impression that something like a John von Neumann character had some savant-like capabilities. And the thing with von Neumann, anything from old enough of an era, is it starts to get very hard to actually find out like legitimate facts about them. right? Because even if it is a trusted person that's saying it, that's also kind of their interpretation. So we think that, somebody like von Neumann would have had these sort of savant-like memory and calculation abilities. But we don't really know for sure, because there are also other ways that he could sort of train that skill or have had some other similar skill without being, a typical savant.
I think all of this comes down to like
Can
a
I?
particular network architecture, right? So I think like if you think about what's physically happening in circuits, probably someone who has knocked their brain or something in a particular way, it's just sort of the structure, the architecture that the information is flowing through is more interrelated, more correlated in ways that sort of normal brain function might not be as correlated in, or not to that level of extreme. So it's just kind of like, what is the architecture of that? So I mean, you could probably study the brains of savants to figure that out.
You know what?
If these are software shifts or hardware shifts, like to what extent maybe some new synchronization takes place and then just persists, which could just be happening really as sort of a computational, almost I know the term software and hardware is a little tricky to navigate, but or is there an understanding in these cases as to whether something physiological really shifts? What's changing? And I think that's very essential in thinking about bringing about these kinds of changes, purposefully, if that's what you're thinking at, which I think you are. Do you have to get in there and get out the old ice pick and start messing around with the hardware, or is it potentially something that could be brought about by internal processes or substances or whatever?
Now that you guys bring some of this up, I'm wondering if like this capacity, like for like savant syndrome like activities, I'm wondering if that's caused by a breakdown in the like barriers between what we call the conscious mind and the unconscious mind, and it essentially allows us to like consciously control some parts of the unconscious mind for like computational purposes in various aspects. Like
That's what this paper seems to be suggesting.
Yeah, so like basically I think that, like I've mentioned before, I think the unconscious mind is technically conscious but not like well integrated with what we call the conscious mind. And if you could tap into that, then in a particular way, perhaps this could cause some savant syndrome like effect.
Just to quote, the abstract says, my hypothesis is that savants have privileged access to lower level, less processed information, which obviously these are hand wavy kind of statements, but that may map to what you're thinking, Michael, in terms of conscious versus unconscious. I think there's a general, I think, intuition in lots of circles and neuroscientific circles that whatever consciousness refers to, it happens sort of later in processing. What's going on in V1 is not what we're have direct access to. It's later in processing. So maybe that's I think what this author is kind of proposing.
Well,
or is it like there's a lot of stuff that's being filtered out from our perception, or saying like maybe it's an accessing or redirecting of some of that lost information?
Well, the thing is, I believe that the unconscious mind is like conscious as well. It's just like not integrated as our like what we call our consciousness, and it's also not like a person type of consciousness either.
Prove it. No, of course. show us
Right. So
that
the consciousness that is integrated that
consciousness.
I'm interfacing with from you is the one that has access to your speech cortex,
Ooh,
Broca's area.
Language.
And
Right.
so
Oh, yep, that's Salon's
when people get
territory,
their
language.
mind severed, it's like, there are these two people inside, and the area for speech synthesis is like it's over by one of the ears, right? The left ear, I think. And so whichever hemisphere of the brain has access to that is the one that people talk to on the outside. And the other one's just kind of floating inside, can't get out, can't say anything.
There's some
Still like move half the body.
There's some
Question.
issues
Go
with
ahead, Michael.
that split brain kind of stuff. I don't know all the issues. I'm not like a brain like specialist, but so this isn't going to be. I can't really give a good rebuttal, though. I did see like a YouTube video by I think a neurologist who was like refuting some of that stuff in that study. So.
Well, Gazzaniga, he's one of the main, he's one of the pioneers of split brain, and his opinion is that the left hemisphere, the one that does the talking, is the conscious one, and the other one is not conscious. But once again, you're always left wondering, well, maybe the other one is just, inside screaming, but can't quite get control of the linguistic system, and therefore, it might well be conscious too. It's just because he says so. I've always disagreed. I've always felt like he's overly bold with that statement.
If
And
we
it could
think
be
about, go ahead.
It could be that it's not just that it can't get control of the language centers. It's of such a fundamentally different character that it doesn't even consider
Yes.
that as a
It doesn't
path.
know language. It doesn't know
It
language.
doesn't even want to do that, because neural pathways could connect in some sense. But Michael, I think you're right on in the sense that I think there's a different consciousness in there. I think it's it might be linguistic, but not in any kind of language that we think of in the ordinary self. So I was actually thinking something similar this morning. I meant to share with you, Elon, like just the dream state itself, because I'm like waking up from this intense dream and it's like fading away very quickly. And I no longer have reportability. It's still in there. It still feels very active, even in the dynamic. The flavor of it is still echoing, but somehow this thing that's talking right now on this video call doesn't have whatever was connected briefly. It seems disconnected. And I think I had always thought of that as, okay, it's just not recording. The hippocampus isn't active. You're not writing this down, but it could be more subtle than just not remembering it. It could be it's this other entity in some sense, or a different form of your consciousness that doesn't really have access to the waking one.
Yeah, no,
Anish
Actually,
may have some thoughts
Sorry,
on
that memory thing on split brain
me check.
patients is just reminding me. There's actually one small issue with that, which is, yes, there is the lack of ability to verbalize what is, say, in the tactile test in the left hand versus the right hand. However, when you switch hands, there is the ability to recognize if it was the same object or not, which actually sort of goes in face of your theory on memory.
Interesting.
Because if memory is part of that generative conscious loop, and that language loop certainly doesn't have access at the time of the sensation to the other half, if you will, then the memory also wouldn't have access to the other half, and yet it does.
I think I'm pretty sure I mean, I have a sort of weirder relationship with the whole dream and sleep thing, which again, I mean, now when I kind of like lay this all out there, it's kind of no surprise I got like really interested in neuroscience and cognitive science and all that. But I wonder, like, are there other things in a waking sober state that take this to the extreme that we just don't really add that as a label for? Right, because I also think that they're like, I mean, this is going to sort of touch on time perception tomorrow, but also like if you think about, there are a lot of things that you kind of experience but don't have a specific word for. You can describe it using language, but there's not technically an existing word for it, right? And I recall we were talking at the other salon about like when you sort of choose a viewpoint on something, you're also not seeing something else, right? So I mean, if I'm looking at my screen right now because of the limitation of my observation, I'm not necessarily going to see what's on the side or behind me or above me or whatever, right? And so I do wonder, like, what are some other states that we have, while we're sober and awake, that we just that fully fit that description, but we just haven't realized? Because I've also kind of thought, I experimented on my own. Maybe Cooper can talk about this. Is like in the case of time perception, your perception of time changes all the time throughout the day. Like it changes all the time. And I think one of the easier ways, since part of the salon is going to be towards inducing these different forms of cognition or neuroplasticity, is, how do we kind of train things, right? And so I've noticed that, if you just really try to sync with the clock right? So kind of sync with the clock, then don't look at it, try to guess the time. And you do this throughout the day, like you're going to notice how much your perception of time changes throughout the day, and like tiny moments, you know. So I'm just wondering if anybody else has experienced that. Maybe Jesse has. Mish.
Yeah, I mean, like I'm kind of in my hot take or whatever opinion. I don't even really know that it is, but more like I think the notion that like there's a lot of uniformity or staticness in like experience of time or some perception things is comfortable for making theories that we talk about, but not always, you know, accurate, and hard to really specify why. But yeah, even like, you know, when I'm waking up, I don't feel the same thing as when I'm about to sleep, or if I'm processing a big meal or just had a great conversation or different experiences. Like those are all very, you know, like even some of the attention conversation we had last time, or synthesis that we talked about last time,
Right.
all at play.
Well, like the experience of time is very much event driven, and also abstraction of actual experience, because if you compare humans' time keeping capabilities and sort of this notion of our ability to kind of imagine deep time, that's
I think it's supposed to look cool.
way beyond like sort of directly experiencing current moment of time. So like we can sort of extend a moment and to arbitrary degrees, and different states of consciousness also impact this directly. I don't know what the limits are for time binding.
In memory or in present?
I would say both of them are connected. I mean, like the memory
Interesting.
of the current present is then sort of used to build on a moment. So it's like you're in the current moment, and then you have a memory of like moments before, but it feels like one time event.
Also, predictions of the future ahead too, if we want to count those as perceptions of time.
I don't think we're all talking about the same thing. Can someone clarify with some definitions here?
In my case, I was referring to a few things, right? So I'm thinking of the sort of, from the human perspective, the subjective perception of time and how it changes throughout the day. So, you know, have you ever, you know, you're waiting for class to get over and you kind of stare at that clock, and you're actually making time, time actually feels like it's kind of going slower because you're really focusing on those tiny increments. You're almost in training to it, right? It's all a similar thing happens when you listen to a faster paced song or a slower paced song or whatever. And then, you know, sometimes when you're just kind of very kind of casting a wide net of chunking information as they go in time, it also changes your perception of it. So I was originally referring to the way your perception of time changes throughout the day depending on what you're doing. And my sort of idea on that is what you're entrained to, what your mind is sort of entrained to. And that's something I do want to get into later is the way other systems in the body, say maybe the heart or the liver, would experience time, which is more for tomorrow. But yes, that was kind of clarifying what I was getting at.
Your heartbeat actually changes your perception of time moment to moment as well.
It does.
Yeah,
Studies?
Yeah. Yeah, let me see if I can find
Really?
that. It's like on the like millisecond range. So.
But just coming back to the definitions, what is it? What do we even mean by perception of time right now? What are we talking about? Is this like an empirical study?
Well,
where
so
you're
when
like,
you're looking at a clock and you're like
minute?
really stressed about it, I guess. I mean, you're stacking in like the more frames of memory perceptions, and so when you stack that up, you know, it feels like longer.
Feels like longer. So like retrospectively, how long did the last minute feel? Sort of subjectively, is that what we're talking about?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, also, the paper I just posted with Richard Feynman, kind of asking people to count to 60 in their head, and then, you know, signal when they think a minute has passed. And that you can get some interesting variability. And Feynman was able to train himself to get that very accurate.
I mean, a lot of people can do that very accurately. Drummers in particular.
Yeah, I was just gonna
Most
say on
musicians can
drummers.
do that ridiculously
Because they're
accurate.
actually doing something in their head that's like keeping a metronome. But if they're, let's say, going about their day and you say, how long has it been since you did, the previous actions? Are they necessarily more accurate in that context?
I haven't read studies on that. I'd have to look.
I doubt it. I doubt it.
But
Right?
I
It's
do
just that
I do
you-
think music and neuroplasticity and the way music, listening to music is one thing, but then also sort of like specifically training on music, especially if you're able to play multiple instruments quite well, whatever, is that there does seem to be some pretty notable changes in the brain. And I do think there is sort of a consensus that a brain is going to be in better shape at an older age. And I think you reap a lot of the benefits if you learn the instrument earlier. Like I also remember for things about perfect pitch or an absolute pitch, whatever, that there is sort of it seems to be a cutoff window and you kind of want to learn the thing early on. Right. And so maybe another way to also tie this into neuroplasticity and development is like, why does that window close off? Right. I know we talked about the pruning thing earlier, but like if we think about this a little more abstractly, if you have a dynamical system, why would you want it to be less plastic or more plastic at a certain given point in time? Go ahead, Misha.
What? I didn't say anything.
Oh, I thought somebody said something. Yeah. Because the thing that I think about too is that when I think about plasticity, I don't think about just sort of plasticity in the brain. I think about plasticity in the muscles and the bones and the liver and the heart and whatever. And I think there is this idea that, we're chasing after plasticity, the ability to change and adapt. But I also want to consider the perspective that maybe that's not always a good thing, right? In what conditions is plasticity not a good thing, which we slightly touched on in the beginning?
Could it be due to energy usage of the brain? Since
What do you mean by energy by that?
Since the brain already uses so much of the body's calories and energies, perhaps if
there's a trade-off.
if neuroplasticity was able to basically go to whatever its physical extent was, maybe it would occupy too much energy.
But
so you could actually intake in calories.
Isn't it quite hard to like induce massive neuroplasticity when you reach even if you're in like your 20s and 30s? It seems like it's not the same as when you're younger. All right, so people will say that, there's a big changes in neuroplasticity if you undergo some intensive meditation thing or a psychedelic experience, or you have some very prominent event in your life or whatever, and it sort of just remodels the brain to be at least temporarily more plastic or susceptible to things. I mean, do you think in a sense what happens during sensory deprivation is also a different type of neuroplasticity?
How would sensory deprivation affect neuroplasticity? I haven't read anything on that.
I think part of what happens with these things is you're trying to force something to change, and you have to give it something to change too. All right, so when we're learning a new skill, in a sense, we have to be plastic in order to, understand and utilize that information or whatever that we're using. And sensory deprivation is interesting, also tying into that hormesis thing about, when you undergo sort of deep when you undergo sort of a deeper sensory deprivation, right? Something that will happen to people is they'll come back out into the world and everything just stands out to them a lot more, because it's like their whole palette was just wiped, right? And so I think I would be interested to see more intensive forms of sensory deprivation if that basically makes you better at sort of just seeing things. Like a lot of the times, especially like if you're in a place that you're familiar with, that you go to every day, you do stuff every day, your brain kind of chunks a lot of that. And so you're not going to immediately notice if something is off. Like the details and the stripes in the wood or the brick are not going to necessarily stand out to you as they maybe once did when you first saw it, when everything was kind of new and came to your attention, right? And so I wonder, what are other forms then of sensory deprivation, right? Besides just the way that you can do it in an isolation tank, that induce a similar effect where you're just sort of seeing things more and you're able to maybe remodel things differently because you're seeing other things you didn't notice before, which also ties into the thing Misha and I were talking about with Jesse at the last salon the other day. Do you remember this, Misha?
Yeah. With forgetting and losing an ability.
Yeah, there does seem to be, and this also is kind of the idea about whether you always want to be plastic or not, is that there is a benefit to at least temporarily forgetting something, to look at something with a fresh set of eyes or a new lens of interpreting the information. And in a lot of ways, that's just saying you're getting out of tunnel vision, right? And I have the example that I always bring up for this, right? Is so someone, a lot of producers will, music producers, if they're making things on the computer, whatever, we'll be making our beats, and in the moment it's going to sound like fire, like this is the best thing we've ever heard. We go, we go to sleep, wake up the next day, and then we're like, oh man, this shit sucks. Like this is actually horrible. This beat is just horrible, right? Because I think when you reach a certain point of, I think when you're making the beat, a lot of the times, especially when you're starting off doing these types of skills, is that you're kind of hearing and seeing what you want to see and hear, sort of like the drawing example. And it takes stepping away from it, depriving yourself of that information temporarily to go and look back on it again with a fresh set of eyes. So I'm just curious if anyone's had any ideas with experimenting with that type of sensory deprivation to experience things differently. Maybe Cooper had.
Not so much deprivation. I do have a couple of points there. You mentioned entire sensory deprivation tank. I don't have the study on hand, but I seem to recall that even just closing your eyes can up your working memory. So there may be something to be said for entire deprivation for kind of doing internal work, so to speak. And then you mentioned noticing details such as the wood grain and all that sort of stuff. There are already people that do this who are neurodivergent, like those with autism and certain ADHD sometimes will have that. And that seems to have to do with bottom-up versus top-down processing, which may tie back to how children kind of are developing, in that they process the world mostly bottom-up before they get these top-down concepts of, they just see the world for, oh, this is this wood wall. They don't notice the details of it. So in that way, there's ways to kind of do that by just, because you can manually think and change your default mode way of kind of thinking. It's not going to be the same as a child would, because they have all the obviously pre-pruning and then potential synesthesia and wild mess in there. But in terms of seeing things differently, my play has been more injecting new senses rather than tapering them off. Although there is something to be said for modulation, where you like put on noise canceling headphones and you get more working memory because you're not processing all the background information as much.
Right. So with sensory deprivation or concentrating, meditating, you're turning off like high noise or high signal parts of your brain and focusing on the lower signals. So like the low amplitude signals get drowned out by the bigger ones. You take away the bigger ones and you can make connections between the other ones. So you might not be specifically plastic, but you are making new connections that would otherwise not be brought to your attention.
It's also about the resources mentally for the working memory, like the idea processing, like the place cells and cells that map around in the brain. They are also used for concepts. So you may be able to have more conceptually once without the external distractions of incoming data. You are right as well, though, for the other aspect.
Something else I was thinking about as well is like, what do we know about these sort of lines of work different people across the neurodiverse spectrum will go for, right? Maybe schizophrenics are really good at a certain task. People with ADHD are good at a certain task. People on the autism spectrum are good at a specific task. I do know there's kind of a stereotype for people who are on the spectrum going into sort of the STEM side of things. I don't know if that's entirely true, I would say, but I guess there is kind of at least some connection people make.
Evidence.
Go ahead.
Such strong anecdotal evidence. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, strong anecdotal evidence, right? But I do think that like there are certain ways of viewing the world that are better for certain tasks, and I think a very extreme version of that is what happens with like savant syndrome, right? I think those people that, so there's Jason Paget, there was I think Daniel Tammet. So Daniel Tammet, and I spoke about this a bit on the last one as well, is if I recall correctly, he sort of was not thinking of the world in terms of normal natural language in the way you and I would, but he was thinking of it in terms of numbers. right? So everything had some type of numerical representation to him. So just as we would take two words and combine them together and get a new word, he could take numbers and think of them very abstractly like that, instead of just, kind of mechanically adding them together in the traditional view of things. And so my sort of big picture idea with this is I think that savant syndrome is maybe almost a type of language, right? And what do we know about learning different languages that induce forms of neuroplasticity and changes, sort of wider changes in the brain? I'm sure this is something Alon and William could touch on. But, I think about, okay, what do we know if someone only knows English and they learn Mandarin, or maybe they learn the African click language, or maybe they learn an olfactory language, right? What actually happens in their minds that allows them to make those changes, and what are the far transfer effects of those changes? Because I also think about neuroplasticity, and I think it's a lot of what you're almost chasing after is a type of far transfer. So Alon or Will, if anyone has thoughts on that.
Well, so I want to just back up real quick. So I think,
Yeah.
'cause I sort of get what you're after here, and maybe in a nutshell, where you're in general pointing to certain kinds of neurodiversity, which is kind of long-term, different cognitive patterns, behaviors, whatever you want to call it. And then there's instances that we've talked to deprivation and heck, sleep, whatever, call these all the different modes that brains can go into sort of temporarily, sort of short term. And what you're wondering is whether, and I'm putting words in your mouth, but whether this can sort of be done functionally in a way that's useful, or willfully, purposefully, and
Sure.
and I guess that to me is like that is a big question, right? Because it relates to the earlier points, like you took maybe schizophrenics or people on spectrum, whatever, have certain ways have certain capabilities, and maybe that's not something that you can induce, or maybe it is, right? That's sort of what you're after, right? Is this something that you can or is maybe there's something physiological, structural there, genetic, whatever you want to call it, hardware, whatever term you have, but it couldn't be, for example, taught over a nice kind of a summer session where everybody gets to engage in some sort of some cognitive exercises that then now we can think differently or something like that, right? I think that's sort of what I'm just trying to kind of get the landscape here of what you're kind of scratching at.
Yeah.
Now, I would say to be skeptical, and to put the skeptical view out there, show me examples of cases where, for you mentioned learning a new language or something like that. Typically, I don't know of cases where sort of somebody's, let's say, neurotypical, and then goes through some conventional kind of curriculum. They learn a new language, or they learn calculus, and now they develop what would to the rest of us would look like sort of a cognitive superpower. I don't see any. I don't know if there's any instances of that, and so that's where I would raise sort of a skeptical view. Maybe meditation. People who do meditation a lot. Do we see that
specifically the advanced insight practices from
yes,
our
we
mutual?
see longer term kinds of capabilities coming online that would argue for what you're calling sort of neuroplasticity. I think by neuroplasticity, I'm assuming what you mean is maybe a longer term kind of effective change, not necessarily like sensory deprivation. Right now, I can think better about this problem, but then I come out of the sensory deprivation problem and it's poof, it's over. You're talking about sort of affecting longer term, almost structural changes, not necessarily physiologically, like in the traditional sense, but maybe whatever, who knows what the mechanism is. Is that what you're kind of going for here? And if so,
Sure,
is there sort of evidence for practices, and maybe meditation is a good one, that can do that? I think to me that's sort of like the essential question, if in my mind, of like this conversation. But tell me if I'm wrong.
there is evidence that prolonged sensory deprivation can lead to structural neuroplasticity.
In a functional way, such that you see benefits, or at least in some domains.
I don't think they're benefits.
That's another
But-
one, right?
but there is
a
evidence.
I'm not sure that's what we want. So are we looking for beneficial, or at least willful, purposeful? Like, I want to be able to count like Rain Man. I want to be able to do that, right? And I'm like, I'm gonna just every day I'm gonna start, just to expose myself to certain kinds of stimuli and doing some practice, and boom, I'm able to do it. or is that inaccessible because that's a physiological structural thing that just you can't get there by sort of traditional a non-genetic physiological whatever that is, traumatic, whatever it is that you need in order to get to the structural changes. I guess that's what we'd be looking for, because presumably we're interested in beneficial or purposeful changes. I think that's what you're, Addie. I assume that's where you're after.
Yeah, or Kareem, you got a question?
Not a question. Well, I mean, maybe so there's somebody here who could shed light on certain psychedelics that can induce certain neurological stages. I think it doesn't have to be a practice. Maybe a psychedelic would actually be a quicker route to some of these things.
So that's a great example of, I mean, there's these long-standing Johns Hopkins studies that were going on under the radar. Now they're coming to light a little bit more, where long-term changes induced by psychedelic experiences, sometimes by even a single experience, people see dramatically different outcomes in terms of certainly for depression. I don't know, I'm not an expert on it, but I know that there is some evidence for that, and maybe that's a good example. But yeah, I mean, maybe that's an example of a long-term quasi-structural change induced by something, but that's an outside substance. Or is that
Long-term, yes. Permanent, no.
Okay.
I haven't seen any evidence on permanent.
I don't know. Okay. I don't know what, I think I've heard it said that it's lifelong, but I don't know.
I think an interesting question would be, can you just prompt yourself?
Right.
What we've seen with these language models is that you don't need to change the transistor chemistry, so to speak, right? They don't need chemicals to change their state. You can prompt them into thinking differently. And I think that's the thing I'm interested in, is how do we prompt ourselves? What's the best mechanism and practice for that? Is that what we call prayer? Is that what we call different languages? I've been thinking recently, if we look back at say like the British Empire and all the admirals and the people who ran the Navy, those people as kids were taught Greek and Latin. And at first proclamation, think, what in the world does Greek and Latin have to do with running a Navy, right? Like why would the British be spending money to educate their children that way when they know they're going to end up being, or they want them to be admirals and captains of naval ships and do sailing? Why bother teaching them Greek and Latin? And so there must have been something about creating those word vectors, creating those representations, learning how to translate from English to Greek to Latin and back and forth, that somehow made those, when they became officers, they were good at prompting not only other humans, but themselves in terms of what to do. It also made me think of, when you were talking earlier, Adi, like language itself, I think maybe we could think of as generalized synesthesia. I'm using one modality.
I equate language and synesthesia, but that's for another time. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think maybe like it's sort of a generalized, or language would be one kind of synesthesia that's just really common and really powerful, and we install it in young people. And I'm interested in apprenticing other kinds of synesthesia. That's one of the motivations behind our Soul Ray Soul project, and some of the things that we were doing. Because like somebody like Feynman, who had this visual color synesthesia, he claimed that algebra was really easy because he could just move all the green stuff to one side, all the red stuff to another side.
It's like how I was talking yesterday about I was talking with Reese about the music and emotion stuff, where if I was trying to construct, an image artistically or music or whatever, is that I would actually make that in terms of the emotion, and then the sort of sounds would just fall into place. Like I wouldn't really have to think about putting the sounds there. It's a very similar thing, I think.
Right. And if we could apprentice these things, and it reminds me of like the early days of transistor production, that literally like one in 1,000 would work, maybe 3 out of 1,000. They would make 1,000 transistors and 3 of them would work. If we were to train in kindergarten 1,000 young people and 3 of them ended up with the kind of synesthesia that Feynman had, that would be tremendous and could absolutely rock our technical civilization. So I think that's why we need to consider, how do we train? How do we create, we're talking about the acquired savant syndrome. Elon was joking about ice picks and stuff. But if there was a way to go in and actually purposefully do these things, whether it's with prompting or something else, it's hard to imagine humanity wouldn't have found that at least one time along the way.
Elif, you had your hand raised.
So I think like it's interesting thinking about this idea of like what is the curriculum that you can teach a brain to sort of change its cognitive state. It's sort of like you're composing a bunch of operations on the current state in order to make it access states that, like for instance, like you could teach someone with words about how to lucid dream, right? That's like you're literally training them to like reason about how to think about their brain and their body and the world model they're currently undergoing their perception in, and then you're training them just through words because you're making a map in their brain for them to sort of like use that interface. So I think it's very interesting to think about this idea of like, is our words enough? Like, are words enough to actually get these abilities, like make them accessible? Because we already know, like, there's tons of literature about psychogenic illnesses where it's like you believe that you have this illness and you are literally giving yourself symptoms that are like, I mean, placebo is very powerful, but also just self-belief in like a certain idea or concept. You can convince yourself you are experiencing something, but you can also experience that thing as well. So it's like kind of like there's a lot of unknowns about what the limits of that are.
That ties a lot into that whole thing about my psychosomatic placebo language type of thing. I may as well talk a little bit more about this. So, okay. So something I've been interested in for a while is that, you can listen to a song. It's just, it's just noises in a sense. And you can literally kind of feel like depressed or really excited about it. Like if I listen to kind of a more upbeat song, even if the tempo is the same as another song, like I will feel like, all right, I'm kind of feeling ready. Like sometimes if I'm prepping for something, I'll listen to like a song or something that's just going to make me feel more outgoing and like charismatic. And then, maybe I'll listen to a Juice WRLD song or something and I'm going to just feel kind of depressed or something, right? But it's interesting that you can just listen to the sound and you can have, if somebody were to measure what's happening in your body in terms of your blood work or whatever, they would notice some biochemical changes as a response to that, even though it's not technically physically controlling your mind in any way. And then I would also think about like the fact that you can you have a stop sign, right? I think I presented on this a couple of times before, but you have a stop sign. That red stop sign is not doing anything to physically stop you. And yet you stop at it. You stop at the red light and go at the green and slow down at the yellow, hopefully, right? Congratulations, this sort of inanimate object just controlled your mind in a really weird sort of way. And the thing that I used to think about...
It's because you're running a virtual machine.
Yes. Yes, I think that's certainly part of it. And it's sort of like if you're in a room or something and somebody says the word, fire or something, right? All that you're hearing is the sound, and all of a sudden your whole biochemical state physically is just completely changed. Right? Like you're gonna be in a more attentive, maybe frantic kind of a state after that, and then the other thing that I would think about too is like if we look at these sounds and these experiences as a kind of language as something that you can learn and attribute some visceral feeling to, what else could you kind of train, right? So the other thing that I used to experiment with when I was younger is like with headaches and migraines and all that type of stuff, right? And I found that if I take, a medication that reduces that symptom, that symptom of pain or whatever, and if I really focus on that over a period of time and associate that with like a symbol or a thought inside of my head, a distinct symbol or thought, I can then, when I'm experiencing the pain, at least subjectively call on that as I would think about a memory or a word or whatever. And because of how strong that association is, the pain starts to at least subjectively go away. I don't know if you look at, my head or neck and you'll notice an actual physical change there, but I can tell you subjectively, the pain goes away at least for a while. I've also found that this is something that athletes also do. Like top professional athletes will try to train a similar thing to get in the zone. And I also think very good actors do a similar thing, where they're able to almost change their sense of self and their perception of things at will to get into character. And sometimes that could be a really powerful tool to understand people. You know, I think very good therapists and just people in general should be able to sort of very directly step into the shoes of somebody else to understand them. But then also in the case of method acting is that might make you a hard person to deal with when you're when you're not in character or not, you know, acting in front of the camera. So anyways, my point with this is that this sort of ways that we associate things that can induce changes are very, very interesting to me. And I'm fascinated by what is something that we haven't thought of or explored in this yet. So actually, hold on. Cooper had their raised hand. Let me go for it, Cooper.
I had a couple things on. I don't know what we mean by plasticity versus, say, ability to take perspectives on abstract information, let's say. Because, like with savant syndrome, I think probably due to their neurology, they have access to certain perspectives and patterns they can have access to, like with synesthesia as well, that has ties with the synaptic pruning. They seem to have oddities with that, not necessarily all to the same extent and in the same places, but seems to be some ties to that. So I'm not certain we can have access to the same patterns and lenses, so to speak, they have onto information. They may have more plasticity in that sense, in ability to take many different lenses. But that's not to say we couldn't find some sort of, to borrow from programming, a polyfill into that sort of thing for ourselves with our own neurologies that may be different than theirs. The sort of lens for ourselves that runs on our hardware. Don't like calling it the brain hardware, but you know, that's kind of what it is. Like you were saying, the savantism being a language. I don't necessarily think it is a universal language versus one unique to each individual, perhaps to different elements of the biology of the brain. If we go to the biological side with each cell being individual agents and then groups of them as well, kind of like organs, maybe there's sections of the brain you can have different communication with internally. And that's why some people have access to these different quick fire processing, like certain synesthesias will give access to number and pattern recognition faster, or certain concepts faster, and this sort of thing. And in that way, I don't know if we can get one-for-one matching, but like with cognitive behavior therapy shows, we can sort of install these cognitive sub-processes, so to speak, for associations between either sensory input triggers or like concepts even. So in that way, we may be able to build associative patterns like a language of our own to some of these ideas. But I don't know if that's plasticity per se. I don't know. What do you think? Where would plasticity lie versus just the lenses we can take on information?
Before I hand it to Michael, I would say in terms of phrasing neuroplasticity, in terms of what we're talking about, right, is like, I think part of it is plasticity is able to step away from your current perspective or path or lens on something and then change it. Right. So I talked a lot about, actually, I did that in the interview with Karen on the meeting code, as I talked about my time with like a very noticeable case of like agnosia when I was younger. Now I can kind of control things, which I'm actually kind of thankful for. But at one point it was very difficult. And what would happen with whatever this was is, you know, I would read something, whatever I could read. You know, the example I'll give is it's talking about water. I'm reading, you know, a paper or article on water, but my mind will think that will think and be completely convinced it's talking about, you know, if it's a paper on sound, it's actually talking about water or color or feelings or like a glass table or numbers or like just sort of going all over the place. Like it would kind of move around a lot. And what I noticed is that I can kind of, if I really focus on one just enough, I can get it to stick, and then I can switch between those perspectives of reading things, right? And that's also kind of just the way that we interact with our world. Like right now, if we're in a room or something, like we have a sort of contextual understanding that this is a room, and we would be acting very differently if we felt like we were actually not in our own room, right? It's sort of like I'll give another example, is that when people first start filming or something in front of a camera, like the camera, like they'll get really nervous in front of the camera, even though the camera is not physically doing anything to you. It's the perception of the camera, because you could be filmed, and if you don't know it, right, if you just can't see the camera, you'll act as you normally would if there wasn't a camera. But just seeing that visual information or having the idea that that's there completely changes your behavior and the way you're interacting with things. And part of this plasticity thing is that you can step away from that perspective and have the opportunity and freedom to switch to something else. And not just something else that you have in your toolkit that you've trained on, but something else that you haven't done before, which is why I'm saying there's a kind of transfer element to plasticity, right? It's sort of like with languages, I can combine two things together and generate something that wasn't there before, at least in that form, right? So when
Especially
I talk
if you use
about
German,
go ahead.
I was going to say, especially if you use German,
Right.
they're already doing that with their own language structure. It's
Right.
already convoluted in itself.
Right. Yeah, and I guess I also do think that some people that are just I feel like this also gives a perspective on the way we conceive of intelligence just in general. I'm sure Elif will have a lot to say about this topic. But on intelligence, because what do we actually mean by something general, right? Because the idea of you can kind of learn all these different skills or whatever is that there's a level of change your brain or your mind can undergo where it can easily adapt and accommodate those differences in perspective or whatever. It's like, okay, the way I would look at it is let's say I'm learning a language. Okay, I'm learning how to speak French for the first time, but I'm also playing a piano. And is there a worldview that you can take that you can do the same thing and get okay, let me phrase this. Can you adopt a worldview, a lens of viewing and experiencing the world that lets you play piano and learn French equally well, or at least very similarly, right? And I think what that is that's the worldview thing. There's a part of me that believes with people that will score higher on some type of intelligence tests is they just have a worldview, a lens that sort of accommodates those different things. Because normally someone would be like, oh, what does learning, to play a piano or guitar have to do with learning French? But what if you learn to play a piano in the way that you would learn to understand the French language? Or just in the way that you would play a piano, can you literally take over that lens or perspective of viewing the world when you learn the skill of playing a piano and then transfer that over to, say, learning a language? And I wonder if we really got to the bottom of it and we asked people that would score, traditionally higher on these types of intelligence tests, if they're not doing something similar to that. Okay, Michael, you had your hand raised.
So the fact that various brain trauma can induce this savant syndrome suggests that either it's there's this combination of the both brain damage and the healing from that brain damage, which is responsible for it. And if it's mainly the healing aspect, then in theory you could have some hormesis drugs, and which you could apply to specific parts of the brain, potentially by having a release mechanism which is induced by something like ultrasound, and you could induce this hormesis effect in certain regions and potentially induce specific kinds of savant syndromes without
Yes. I have many thoughts on this. I'm going to get to Kareem and Alif in a moment after this. But on the hormesis thing, since that's a very big obsession of mine, and I kind of enjoy talking about it. So on hormesis, right? Because if you think about say your skin, for instance, the big thing about hormesis is something is not just filling in the existing loss and recovering the original state, but it's actually overcompensating. All right, so when you cut your skin or whatever and you have a scar, that's technically your body overcompensating for it, right? But maybe that's actually not, we don't want scars a lot of the time, right? And so when I talk about the sort of hormesis properties of something like tretinoin or microneedling in skin, is it's a very specific pattern of damage or loss of information that you're inducing. And so it doesn't, you don't develop a scar, you develop a different type of adaptation in the skin, right? So anyways, I just want to use that as an example about the way that we train things, because hormesis is basically the idea of how you have these sort of doses of stress, of things that would normally destroy you, And then if you limit that and distribute it throughout time in a pattern, the organism can adapt to that. And I don't know if I've talked about this with Alif before, but the perspective that this comes from, let's say someone is, let's say someone's hooked up on a treadmill or something and they're lifting weights or whatever. They're running with weights on, ankle weights and wrist weights or whatever. And if some random person walked into the room, saw the computer screen of all their metrics, they think, all right, this person is they're gonna have a heart attack, they're dying, their lungs are going crazy, heart's going crazy, all the stress markers in their blood are through the roof, what's happening? But if they look at them, they're like, oh wait, they're just running, right? And interestingly, if you in a lot of ways, a running and these exercises are like you're dosing a heart attack in very, very tiny ways. And that could also be why that, exercise, aerobics and aerobics, are beneficial towards defending against cardiovascular issues, right? And if you think about fasting and calorie restriction, which are pretty big in the longevity field, the reason that they seem to have some utility is because in their extreme form that would normally kill you, which is starvation, you're dosing it. And you do get slightly different effects, whether you're chronically calorie restricted or you're patterning it in terms of some type of fasting routine. Same thing with extreme cold or extreme heat in terms of sauna or cold therapy, right? And so when you even like if you're lifting a weight, like if you can't lift 100 pounds normally, you're not going to be able to do it or it would hurt you or kill you. But if you break that up in terms of if you're doing 10 pounds and you move to 20 and 30 or whatever, gradually you can lift that and it no longer hurts you, right? So I do think that there's something to that about the learning process, right? Because your skin is learning after it gets cut to go and induce the scar, right? It's generating a scar. It's like a language as a response. If you think of language as the sort of hormesis process, right? But depending on the way that you dose that stressor, that change, right? Something that maybe induces a type of plasticity in the system, it responds differently. So anyways, back to Kareem. He has his hand raised.
Well, actually, I don't have anything to add on this. Just want to say thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I'll be going now. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a good one.
Alif, by the way, Kareem is now in Cambridge. You guys should meet up.
Oh,
You
Alif,
guys
you're
were at
here
the
too?
hackathon together.
yeah.
He was at the hackathon.
Like Alif, what was your project? Or did you have one?
No, he was helping. He was helping the event.
Okay. Well, yeah, I'm
He was-
here in Somerville.
He was a mentor. He was a mentor. He was helping take photos and everything. He was great. And then so is Jesse. Jesse is
I'm
also
here in
all three of you
Boston.
are in
Try
Cambridge.
to
now.
say hi next
Oh,
time.
awesome.
Okay, perfect. Maybe we can coordinate something in the future.
Yeah,
Definitely.
go for it.
All right, thanks,
All right,
guys.
bye,
Have a
Kareem.
good one.
See you. Bye.
Bye.
All right, Alif, your hand raised. Let's go for it.
Yeah. So, are you familiar with like kind of like stuff of the literature on locus of control? Basically, like for anyone who doesn't know, like locus of control is like essentially simplified. It's like your belief in your own self-control of like there's like this distinction of external versus internal locus of control. It's like internal locus of control is like you feel like your actions affect the world, and what you do actually affects what happens, versus external is more like it's up to the world. It's not really up to me.
Right.
And in terms of like outcomes, empirically, people that believe that they control their actions, they take less risky actions and they have higher self-esteem in general. And there's a lot of positive outcomes when you actually believe that you and the converse is like learn helplessness. Like it's like, oh yeah, just passively like the world will just do whatever. But it's very interesting when you talk about like how the worldview impacts your cognitive abilities and the kind of conclusions that you make, because it's so true. And these are very, very simple things, even like these are things that you can learn. These are things that like are very fundamental. And it's like, it just makes me think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in our educational system that really isn't, part of the curriculum
Right.
in general. And it would be interesting if more of these kinds of topics were brought to some format into classrooms, because I mean, stuff like procrastination, the stress that people have, the way that people problem solve. I mean, it's kind of absurd because even though we have like AI that can like answer all these questions, you still need critical thinkers that are like able to ask questions and even understand the answers. And I mean, like, you know, right now, people are often, there's a lot of people that kind of don't really understand how their own decision making, their own like belief systems are coming in the way of them actually, for instance, like being more open-minded about like ways to think about the world. And then like this is systemically throughout, like, and you know, teachers, right, like learn to not critically think, and then they kind of spread this to everyone else. And then it's like, unless you're lucky enough to have someone who encourages you to critically think, you kind of get stuck in this like this low point. And so, I mean, just like all these different forms of cognition that everyone's doing at different points in time, you know, it makes me think like, are humans actually good at transfer learning? I don't know. It might, we might have a very brittle, but we have the capacity to do it very well, which is not something machine learning has gotten to that yet.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the learned helplessness thing is very fascinating to me, like extremely fascinating, because it is sort of that thing about, yeah, it's your lens, your belief, or whatever is literally kind of controlling what you're able to do. And that's the thing where it's like a lot of very successful people that we sort of attribute, you know, like in the startup world, they'll say, you know, the high agency people, who's the highest agency person, you know, type of thing. Like there's a level of self-delusion you have to have, right? Where it's like you believe you can actually do the thing that other people consider not possible or whatever. And you can break out of your sort of specific norms of where you are. And that's even, that's also just kind of the way when we communicate things, right? Because like a lot of the time when you're pitching somebody on something is you're sort of trying to get them to be able to understand, and in their own way, they're trying to generate your worldview of things, the way you're seeing things in a sense, or at least trying to explain things to them about what's not physically there in front of them, right? So it's like, you know, like it's no secret, and especially in the startup world, like a lot of people will exaggerate their claims or their presentations beyond what's currently there. And we think fondly of the people that end up pulling it off, and then we don't think fondly about the people that didn't. But it is interesting that that's almost an integral part of the way we communicate things that aren't there in front of us. So when we talk about the future, we are kind of talking about a dream. We don't necessarily know that this is definitely going to be the case, you know, and yet we are kind of, there's a slight bit of delusion in there, right? And not even necessarily in a negative sense.
That's like an interesting point about like kind of this idea of like hope, of like a dream, of a belief.
Yes.
When you think about like religious cognition and sort of like this idea of this notion of like, how do you have a belief that allows you to coordinate with like millions of people, right? Like before like mass religions, there was like very little idea wise that would allow you to coordinate amongst like hundreds of millions of people, where it's like, oh yeah, we have this belief, we're part of the same tribe, we believe this thing, like monotheism, like the invention of like higher level kind of social mythologies to coordinate our own behavior and sort of organize ourselves. Like it's sort of like, it's like, oh, if you believe in this thing, it's not about if it's true or not. It's more like just the fact that you do allows like higher trust, and kind of allows like other more complicated things to happen that wouldn't have happened because you didn't have this like shared belief. So it's just interesting thinking about like individual belief tying in with like collective belief, and then it's like the society that people build from collective shared beliefs. And you look at like today's time, and it's like it's harder for people to have shared world beliefs because of just like the complexity of the world, but also just like algorithmic media. And I mean, this is a whole, you know, rabbit hole there, but I think it's definitely something that could be worked on.
Yeah, how does all of how does that fit in, Eddie, to sort of core beliefs and, you know, culture, and even more subtle than culture, maybe language itself as an agent of what we could call neuroplasticity? if somebody comes to you today and says, "Hey, I can convince you that we're all living in in a simulation, and in
Right.
fact you're being mind controlled, and the following thing, whatever it is," right? I mean, we're seeing this globally. People have all kinds of beliefs. Sometimes they're very rapidly changing belief sets, and their behaviors are dramatically changing as a result. Their entire orientation, the way they're processing all information is
Yeah.
shifting. Maybe after a couple of Facebook posts and whatever it is, that is an example of, in a certain sense, of a complete rapid reorientation of the entire cognitive architecture in some ways, based on very soft, purely informational kind of, right? No substances are involved. Nobody has to get hit in the head. You just have to be told that the government's actually evil and is trying to harm you, or vice versa, or
Yeah.
whatever the case may be.
Well,
And
so
boom.
that's interesting. It ties into the comment earlier about neuroplasticity for developing child. So the brain is trying to integrate new experiences into a pre-existing like narrative or worldview or what have you. These predefined notions. And so like plasticity goes down if that core belief is honed in on or amplified, so that new experiences are trying to have information being discarded that doesn't fit in with his model, and then information that goes into it and reinforces it. Or you have to go through a discipline where you say like, oh, I have contradictory information, I have to change this whole thing. That's very difficult when that notion is already defined.
But we're see. I think the contemporary era, and I think as was just pointed out, we actually see many cases of people kind of inverting their worldviews fairly rapidly, and maybe things that we might have thought have been slowly and inculcated over long periods of time, growing up and whatever. The people change their worldviews. I mean, I don't want to get political, but there's a lot of this going on. Where people kind of are flipping their worldviews, becoming and really taking a very different orientation towards almost much of at least societal information. I don't know if they're seeing red and blue differently, but there's whoops, I shouldn't have used those colors, right? Right, but you get my point. And so in some ways suggests that there maybe is a greater degree of, to use the term plasticity, that could be subject to things just like ideas, that ideas can set off a bomb in the mind, and that can change somebody's orientation towards the world.
Ideas can also do that literally.
Well, so this whole paradigm is like this stability plasticity dilemma. I mean, it's like it works at all scales, right? Like on an individual brain, on a sort of social brain, so to speak. There's this interesting network models of information propagation, like disinformation propagation, where you have essentially like a network of agents, and you have information sources, like for instance, like like a website or a trusted news source, and the way that it propagates through the agents, like the people in that network, it actually, you listen more closely to people that are closer to your level of sort of magnitude of polarity. So like if it's like you're -7 and then someone's like 7, right, on this, like you won't listen to anyone after 0, like, but you'll listen to someone who's like -5 or something, and then you might go more towards them. Someone who's on the opposite side will just make you reinforce in your own belief. So that brings this interesting point of like, if you want to algorithmically nudge people to be more open to, you have to basically like show them information about the other side through someone that is near their own perspective. And right now, like if you min-max like the recommender algorithm that, like for instance Facebook and TikTok, whatever runs on, to have max out the engagement stat, it's going to lead to like the worst scenario, which is like structured and engineered on purpose to create rage, because that is the most like sticky, like when we're talking about stability, plasticity, like that is a very stable state where it's like you are just like going to keep coming back, and the hope is that if you keep coming back, then you will buy something. So actually it's like on balance, like all of this stuff, it's like no one even one even necessarily intended that people would, rip apart their family due to random political extremist beliefs. The advertisers were just like, I want you to buy my soap, like get this soap. And we're in this kind of there's like emerging consequences of like min-maxing. And I mean that brings up a whole host of like can of worms about what should we do in the network society. Like we don't really regulate social media. We just kind of are like, oh well, just do whatever, and don't shut us down. And so
There's a reason
I think like
Zuckerberg was at the
Sorry,
inauguration. Yeah.
a small correction.
I
Attractive
can say something,
stability
but-
has nothing to do with it.
Wait, Alon, go first.
Flip it. Sorry.
Oh no, I was just making a
We'll
snarky,
do Alon, Misha, and then Dugan.
I was just making a snarky comment about Zuckerberg showing up at the inauguration because for exactly that reason that the people have been talking about regulation that absolutely on the minds of many people in academia elsewhere, and obviously that is something that certain corporate interests probably do not want to see happen. But I do want to point out just on that note is that, and maybe it's true that nobody anticipated this, is that it is scientifically fascinating, that these networks could sort of self-organize in this way around, these buttons that, the kind of these dopamine, whatever they are, dopaminergic, kind of feedback loops of outrage or whatever it is. But I think it speaks very much to the, again, using the neuroplasticity term, I think very loosely here, that people are so actually extremely malleable, it turns out, in terms of what their even core identity and morals and values are, and that with a little bit of enough feedback loop, social feedback loop, people kind of formed a new identities, and they formed these non-classical kind of non-geographically based, not ethnically based, not religiously based, something else, kind of social groups that really kind of rip apart to me the idea that the culture is sort of is comes with the mother's milk and is just very very a long established feature of a person based on a long developmental arc, that it's people can change really fast into different kinds of people. And I think maybe we shouldn't be that surprised given history, but I think from in relation to this conversation, I do think that there's a lot to be learned, judgments aside, from the fact that humanity is in fact very very malleable, and people, individual and at a social level.
The way I see that is sort of the core belief, the what you're thinking, who you are, that kind of thing, and what flips it is sort of, so the core belief is sort of in the frontal lobe of your mind, in your cognition. And what flips it is sort of like an emotional tribalism thing that if you can switch this, then like the rest will follow. So that's the way I see the
So you see the tribalism as sort of being at the bottom, and that's sort of the stable feature almost, and then these are just different ways of organizing into different tribes. Is that what you mean?
I see it as tribalism, and to your point, like electronic interfacing, communication, like the internet, is allowing for tribal connections to be made that aren't spatio-temporal, that aren't like in your neighborhood, with the people you grow up with or the people who you're going to have culture with. It's going to be, it could be anywhere. Anywhere.
Are people finding their people, or
as long as you can connect with them and connect on like an emotional base.
So are people finding, or I guess to come back to the question of malleability, is it that people are like, I actually like that group and I'm going to join them, or is the feedback from that group changing their minds? There's two different ways of thinking about it.
And the group changes too. It just changes slowly. I think that there's usually when you say something is malleable, there's this idea that if it's highly malleable, then you can mold it into what you want. But that's not exactly what we're seeing here. What we're seeing is attractive states. We're seeing that things are all moving in a certain direction, not necessarily that that direction is very controllable. So these groups,
like steering a large ship, is still malleable, but on a different time scale.
Well,
but at the end,
but it's like steering a large ship where you're dealing with extremely turbulent weather. and you have a rudder the size of, sorry, I was gonna make some bad joke, but you have a rudder that's like tiny.
But to run with the metaphor, I could jump on a different ship, and people did. And so at the individual level, people have choices now in a way they never did, right? To join this
Right.
tribe or that tribe.
Do they?
I think so. I mean, I think that's what you're
Oh,
seeing.
yeah.
People in their basements who, their parents have one view and they were raised this way, and they're like, no, F that. And they're like, no, I'm with these people now. I think that's happens, every
It's like
day, millions of times.
Friends, yeah.
But that's
Sorry?
I mean that's kind of like saying, sorry, Jess, did you say something? It was very quiet.
I was just saying, like, absolutely, like, I think it's both. I don't think it's a clear cut either or. I think it's both in the sense of, like, for the people that are motivated to find very niche things. Like, a lot of my best friends happen exactly what was just said. It's because I didn't grow up in an environment that was conducive to how I see a lot of things now, and I was lucky enough to find a few things, and then a little bit more community, and then, like, it was a slow process of getting used to that for me. But then, like, there's also the same macro. I do agree about the big ship and in a storm. So, like, you have all of these things going on at once, and like, there's different individual capacities and motivations to go against the grain, and select for specific experiences or connections.
Right.
Yeah, but they're not, the groups aren't that they're not that like voluntary. It's not like choosing a group and joining a group. It's moving in a direction, and there are certain directions that you're more or less able to move in, and then that actually changes the landscape, and then other things follow. The groups are emergent. They're not structurally there.
It's emergent, but the individuals who are choosing to be members of the groups can be much more, much more individual, malleable, and fast, rapid. Which to me, again, just coming back to the big we're talking about, is can somebody be changed? Can somebody be, let's go, I don't want to use the word brainwashed, but whatever it is, it could be in without value judgment, but can somebody, watch a video one evening and be like, oh my God, my whole life is changed. And it could be, a religious video. It could be an atheistic video, whatever the case is. And then boom, they are now part of a different group. I think that absolutely is something that happens. I don't know how frequently now. I think it happens frequently. And it argues for the idea that people are at the individual level very malleable. I hadn't thought that before, but
well, there's one little thing, and that's, yes, they can change. The question is, can they change in any direction? I don't know
any
if you
direction,
can see that
arbitrary
as
direction,
meaningful.
you mean? Like an arbitrary direction? No, I mean, there are only so many groups to join.
Well,
So
my point is that can any given person at any given time be moved into any given group, or they're just a subset of those groups
that's a good
that
question.
at any given point in time
Right.
they can be moved into? I'm definitely thinking that there is a subset, a very small one, of directions that you can go at any given time.
Yeah, and like classic, like, old school cybernetics, like, anti-aircraft thing. Like, if you're tracking where a missile's going, it's not just going to immediately turn around and do a 180. It has a very selected range of things that go. Like, yeah, that makes sense for the groups. And
Well,
then there's
I mean,
also
a
like
180
individual.
is a 180 is sort of totally possible in this context, because it's actually not that far of a turn. But yeah,
I mean, I think like primarily like the people that are doing 180s the most are those who don't really have a grounded, like they're not like grounded in facts. Like, so it doesn't really matter what the fact or the reality of the situation is. They're just kind of grounded in like a vibe,
Right.
which is so much more like could be anything, could be arbitrary. Like for instance, if you're like on like watching a reel and like you don't understand science and you don't know like what a virus is, you don't know like molecular structure, you're just like, well, this seems suspicious. Maybe I could get hurt if I get a vaccine or something. You don't know if that's true or not, but it's just like a feeling that you have, and now that can propagate through the network because you can now tell other people like, hey, I'm concerned about this thing, and you don't really know why, but you just are. Could be for a lot more benign things as well. And I mean, like a lot of things just pass, like memes pass benignly with like messages that are not necessarily benign, but like, so you'll just end up repeating things that you don't actually believe, but it just happens to be in your brain. And then people that don't have enough grounding. So in like, for instance, in Finland, in the education system, for digital literacy, they like try to like train kids to actually like inoculate against like internet propaganda and like sources and like what things are, and like there's not a concomitant consistent way that's done in the US, and other Western nations also have varying levels of inoculation. I mean, I would say that actually like we've structured society in the US to make it so that this is hard to access, this like inoculation, because if it was, then you wouldn't be able to just convince someone of random wins as a, you know, economic beneficiary.
Well, doing it for a deliberate purpose and the
Repetition
system essentially doing it on
legitimizes,
its own are
Misha.
very different.
I said repetition legitimizes, Misha.
Yes, it does. Repetition legitimizes. Everyone knows that. Repetition legitimizes.
Repetition legitimizes.
Repetition
You
legitimizes.
keep saying that?
Aren't you?
Repetition
Repetition
legitimizes.
legitimizes.
Legitimize repetition.
Repetition legitimizes.
But it is
Legit misers.
Finding myself being convinced of that somehow.
my thing too is that then like how do we establish what a sort of base truth or fact is? Because I do have this thing where it's like, how do you really know what's true? Because we base the way we live our lives and the way we form ideas and do things even in academia off of things that we learn and have some sort of understanding that it is true. But something that also happens plenty of times is that looking back, as we'll see, oh, maybe this was incorrect. And I'm not making a specific statement. I'm saying just in general as a sort of a cognitive system that tries to, understand the world around it, right? Is like it's like the idea of there's things that maybe are true or not, but they work, right? And so I just again throw a wrench in, because I like doing this a lot. Just to throw a wrench in that, right? Is like, are there things that are maybe not true but are still useful, right? Because then you can ask yourself, is it a good idea that you shouldn't follow truth? I know that's a very kind of crazy thing to put out there, but it's like on the flip side, like, yeah, I like to think of myself as a pretty
Absolutely.
I'm seeking truth, I'm doing whatever, but I also think about, well, what is truth? Right. And that doesn't mean, oh, it could be whatever thing you want. And I don't, I mean, like, when we okay, let's just say we measure.
Yes, it is useful to follow things that might not be actually true, but are functional. For instance, Newton's theory of gravity is sort of, you have these objects and they're pulling on each other with invisible strings over space for no reason. But like general relativity is like, okay, actually, they're not pulling on each other, they're pulling on the space in between them. And
even that's just a metaphor.
Exactly. So like it is functionally true for computation to predict like the motion of planets and stuff and do.
So that's a close approximation rather than you don't even have to subscribe. But there's something like religion, for example. If you're not for example, religious, you may say, well, religion's still very functional, believing that some all-seeing deity that's going to keep people in line and they're going to behave more socially. Free will. You may not believe in free will, but you say, but if people's belief in free will makes them seek justice, and so therefore it's functional. Those kinds of things, of course, they're possible. They're highly probable. It's just society converged on these things probably for their utility, not for their ontology. I always think about that. It's
right. Well, I mean, like a monkey, and then there was like a communal pile of bananas, and the monkey wants to like take a banana. Well, no one else is looking. That's the important thing. But then there's this like social construct of like, well, there's this kind of deity that kind of watches you and makes sure you're good.
Yep.
And so like it's a social program that you download in your mind, and I think it's sort of born out of that.
Yeah, but there are certain
logically. I was going to say, just logically, we already know they can't be true. So something's going on phenomenologically, but just sort of many things claim many maps for the territory, but some maps are not conducive to updating themselves in account of new territory to explore, or even for exploring new territories. So it goes back to the whole truth thing.
I mean, there's plenty of examples
go
of
ahead.
things that are established to not be grounded in truth. For example, like monetary policy. Sorry, someone's messaging.
Sorry. There's a term for this, some sort of useful fictions, like money and all of that stuff.
Are abstractions useful fictions?
And I don't know if fiction is the right word for it. People do use that term. I don't think that's really a right way to put it. Personally, it's not a wrong belief that money exists. It's not. You could say it's a wrong belief that God exists.
Narrative.
It's a wrong belief that money is grounded, though, in a certain physical value.
Right.
Well,
And it's a wrong
remember,
belief that gold has
that value.
intrinsic value to it.
Yes, but
Like, we use gold as a currency as sort of its own fiat. Everyone has to decide that, you can get money, you can get gold, and you can go to someone and they'll make you a sandwich if you give them a little bit of gold.
Yeah, no, but an intrinsic value is not something that's really grounded in fact or not grounded in fact. It can't possibly be. But there are
This is the idea of
extrinsic
trust too, right?
properties that are.
This is the idea of trust. Is how can I trust that if you give someone $1, you're going to get the correct thing that's agreed upon in return, and that you can even know what is the correct thing to be given back. And yeah, like if you just say for $1, that's a little more simple. But if you look at more kind of larger abstracted ideas of a currency or whatever, I mean, I say like ideas are intellectual currency in a lot of ways, right? There's intellectual capital, there's social capital, there's all these different types of things that we form our own sort of, I would call them like biological and cognitive economies around, right? And it's interesting. It's interesting because like even the Salon is kind of a cognitive economy right now. The reason that there's dynamics is that there's exchanges going around. And when one unit of that network sort of hoards it all up, you could say this is sort of like what people will critique about individuals that are very wealthy and they hold their wealth. Or, biologically, you could say this is when people are retaining a lot of energy in their body. Now some people would say, oh, well, that's obesity, but maybe also muscles and bone mass and height are all also retaining structure, and you're usually not giving up your height or your muscle. Ideally, you'd prefer not to, right? So then if you look at those as some kind of economy, why is it that we prefer that people would rather hoard muscle and bone density rather than say obesity or whatever, right?
We can't look at those as an economy because there's no ability for exchange.
There is. It's maybe not on the standard scale that we'll just go and kind of put it out in the world directly, but an idea is that if you consume too much of something, you store it as fat or adiposity, whatever. Maybe Michael would have a comment on this. And it's the way that you're consuming things and not giving things in return and exchanging things back, right?
Define a transaction.
Transaction is an exchange of something that you both require.
No. Define a transaction in this economy. Define a transaction in the economy you're proposing.
Like, what's an example of it here?
Like food?
You
Like
say,
if you
eating
have a
transaction?
specific, let's say you're in a smaller group of people, and when you have a limitation that kind of breeds prioritization, right? And so it's like, okay, well, who gets the food first? All right, tribes will give it to kids or whatever. They'll maybe give it to the person that does the defending or whatever. And it's like, okay, maybe you give it to whoever needs it more metabolically, but what does that even mean? Right. And the point that I'm trying to make with this and the way I'm defining this is that the value that we use to run these things is based off of a shared understanding or agreement, and that there's trust that this is what we're getting. Right. It's like, let's say, oh, it's like clickbait and false advertising. Oh, you're getting an iPhone, but it's actually just a knockoff. But you paid for what you thought was an iPhone. Right. It's the same thing that happens in the investor and startup world. Is there's plenty of people that will oversell on that dream. They'll clickbait the investor. They'll do that type of thing, and the exchange happens, and then one party is not very happy, but the other party is very happy. So part of an exchange is that both agents have some level of a shared satisfaction because they both had a shared stress. And that
Wait.
transaction alleviates that.
Hold on. The you said something about a shared concept of value.
Yeah.
Kind of the whole point of an economy is that you don't have to have a shared concept of value. Just every agent has to have a value. And I'm
But
still a
that's
little bit confused as far
but
as
they
this like
still
muscle
share
and
that they
adaptation
still share
where
that they
they're-
have a value. They still share they don't have to have the same exact value, but they share the understanding of the idea of a value.
well,
If they
there-
don't
there need
understand
not be-
value, good.
there needn't be anything in common between any two agents' values at all, as long as
In
the
what sense?
value is consistent within the agent, at least at a certain point in time.
Yeah,
But
at a certain point, because it's also like the exchange. If you look at communication and talking and language as a kind of exchange, right? If I'm doing a certain task and I only know English and you're talking to me in Italian or something, how much can I directly on how much can I from my English prior and understanding understand Italian to make use of that, right? Because that perfect ideal whatever picture of a transaction is, okay, you're talking to me in English and I can basically understand what you're saying and get the thing done. All right, so also think about this in the way that we translate between currencies, right? So we have a yen and a dollar, or a Canadian dollar and a US dollar, or whatever. But then if you go beyond sort of the money thing, it's also in the way that we exchange ideas and the way that we exchange different forms of modeling the world. This is the lens thing about plasticity that I'm trying to tie back into. I know I was dodging around some of the questions. I'll try to get back to them if you ask me again. But what I was trying to get at is that a lot of what happens with plasticity is that there's an exchange that's happening between, say, mind and the environment. There's this thing going back, right? And it's like, if the reference frame of the goal remains, right? If somebody gives you instructions in Italian, and there's a need to utilize these instructions, if you don't fully understand it, your mind as a subjective observer is going to try to make sense of that as much as possible. Which is also the same thing that we see happen with metabolism and the way that we train things in the body, is that there has to be a sort of primer to get it to view things a certain way and change if it needs to, right? And so, for instance, like just throughout our conversations in person or in salons or whatever, is we're saying something, but sometimes the other person doesn't necessarily fully understand it in the way that we'd want them to. And so there has to be that translation, a change that's made. There's some level of plasticity that has to happen to make that leap over, right? And so my thing with this is how in the ways that we interact and exchange actions with our environment or other agents, how does that affect plasticity? Right? Could you say learning a very difficult skill induces more plasticity than learning a more simpler skill that's easier to learn? Jesse maybe has a comment.
I have a side thing, and I
right.
kind of it's a statement, and we don't have to go into it, but just like saying,
Yeah.
I'm really fascinated with sort of a maybe similar or adjacent kind of thing, where from an agent and environment sense, what are things when an agent is presented with accurate information or good reasonings or all those important things that would change them, but reasons why it's not processed or interpreted. Like I had many examples of this in my life, and some people very close to me that is not because they weren't exposed to certain things or weren't quote unquote intelligent enough or didn't have certain capacities, but there were other factors that heavily mitigated their chance to like grasp or develop or go in that direction. So that's something for another time, but I think it's interesting. The agent environment and what can catalyze or inhibit is a interesting space.
Salon,
I just wanted to bring up
At least,
something about like something you said about like kind of like the idea of like information exchange as an economy. Like there's like a specific subgroup of like microeconomics regarding information economics, and sort of like the essentially like information is a signal that's like basically regarding uncertainty. And then there are special goods that are sort of like that update this uncertainty, like scientific knowledge or like a theory. And like there is an information asymmetry, which all economies are essentially
Correct, yeah.
operating with asymmetries. And essentially like the value is in like, oh, if I give you this thing, if I give you this book, like you'll know something about like navigation, and that will
Right.
make you more effective at like this other
Right.
proximal thing that you're trying to do. I think like when you think about in general how matter and energy organize and biological life organizes under uncertainty because the entire world is uncertain always. It's basically like all the main thing that like money is trying to do is like have a one-dimensional language for communicating uncertainty and minimizing sort of being able to exchange the minimization of that uncertainty because essentially like you have more money, you have more control, your voice matters more, so there's less uncertainty for you, but then there's like this huge problem where it's like if you have too much of that, then now like you have absurd economies, information economies become absurd
Right.
because it's like a market failure, which is the problem with all economies is that they're breakable. So
It also
Mhm.
reminds me of, or go ahead, Misha.
Define breakable.
yeah, by breakable, I just mean that it's inherently the dynamics of it. If you evolve any economy in time, is always subject to this these like attacks of preferential growth, which is like a basic network growth algorithm where it's just like if you have more money in the next time step, you will in the next time step probability get even more. Same thing with like information. If you control more information propagation, that message will, and then eventually like the point of like having diverse information, which is supposed to increase survival, isn't possible. So like the original purpose of the system might have been like, oh yeah, we're gonna like distribute things so we can do multiple things at the same time. But then it's like it sort of like crumbles under its own weight is sort of what I mean. It's not an exact definition necessarily, but just like these failure modes.
I was gonna make a comment coming from sort of design interests and backgrounds is that, you know, when you're designing a product and you're marketing your product, you're doing whatever. I mean, this goes for anything, just in communication, but I'm thinking about a product, right? Is a good product has the right amount of thing to stimulate you to try to understand and transfer it because that feels new. If it's exactly understandable, then it's the same. There's not really change to be noted, but there's a slight translation and understanding that you have to make a slight change, and a lot of times that may be something that we consider good design, right? If someone is trained on like brutalism design and they see like traditional architecture, how do we know that they're going to still have the same appreciation or reaction to that, right? And so it's like when I think of a good product or thing or a good product, a good idea that was launched into the zeitgeist, right, is you kind of had this optimal level of right place, right time, right? Like it was just at the right time and place that it affected people a certain way. And yeah, it's new enough where people have to take a little bit of an adjustment, but it's an approachable adjustment. Right? There's a thing people will say like in design where if you're working on something that's really, really out there and new, you have to have something that is approachable and shared from the existing paradigm, right? So it's like when, you know, when computer interfaces and all were coming out, especially people will talk about like skeuomorphism in iOS and Mac OS, right? It's part of what happened, right? When you're dealing with this very sort of novel thing for a lot of people, which by the way, operating on a computer is still novel for some people today, right? And you know, what do? The Notes app looks like the physical notes that you have in front of you. The clock app looks like a clock app or like a physical clock you have in front of you. You know, they have these sort of real world analogs that are able to bridge those things over, right? And so, you know, if we just went to, you know, iOS 14, whatever we're on now or something, and he showed that to someone who is accustomed to only dealing in physical objects, it's going to be up to them as the observer, as a cognitive system to be able to bridge that. which in a lot of ways is what we attribute to, say, intelligence, is the ability to bridge those gaps and reach those conclusions with less information, spoon-fed to you. And so a lot of what good design does is it's trying to basically outsource some of the processing that you'd have to do as an observer to understand it to the other agent, right? So if I want to design, if I want to, like, cars are built, okay, keyboards are built the way they are because of how our hands and fingers and arms are. You can have the function of a keyboard designed very differently. And matter of fact, there are other keyboards that are designed differently. If any of you have seen those other ones that are split off and shaped in different ways, right? You can have a spherical keyboard if you really wanted to, but is that going to be as functional for our current constraints as a body, as the way we currently have them, right? So I think of all of these as these sort of cognition economic exchange systems between one observer and the thing that's being observed. And I guess the point that I'm making with that is that radical, or maybe not, radical or large enough of a change induces a type of plasticity. But if it's too much, it destroys the system, which goes back to that hormesis thing where it's like, yeah, if I can't normally deal with lifting 100 pounds, well, what do? I break it up into chunks throughout time, right? In this sort of pulsing fashion. And then now I can adapt to that, and that doesn't destroy me anymore, right? So I think there's something very interesting about the things that we use to induce change. Because one of the things I wanted to talk about for the salon today was ways of inducing plasticity and change in a system. And I think we kind of got around to that a bit here and there in different ways, right? But yeah, I think part of inducing change is the observer has to disagree with something. It has to cause friction from their existing lens of viewing the world, right? So it's like, have you ever learned a new skill? And do you guys ever feel like that burn in your head, that kind of friction or burn for the first time you're trying to do something? Or maybe you're in some specific mood and then you have to go and do a task that you don't want to do for whatever it is. Oh, you don't want to clean your room or something or whatever, or finish some work or school task. And you kind of feel this bit of friction or a burn, right? It's that is the kind of stimulus that, if the original momentum stays, that induces the change. And then after that, you can now, in theory, switch between those different states, right? So it's like what I talk about with the agnosia thing or whatever, is that, I can pull up, we can pull up an article on money, for instance, or not. We'll say I can talk about, let's say statistics or actually, no, okay. We'll say thermodynamics. We'll pull up a paper on thermodynamics. If I were to read this as if it's talking about behavior or cognition or agency, that kind of sounds like Friston's free energy principle, right? And so some people are going to initially, as a language thing, to Alon's point, you're reading it under that context. And then in order to induce the plasticity and the change, you have to sort of perturb that, which is also the hormesis thing. Yeah, so what I think is, if you think about how do economies change? I don't know why I'm talking about economy stuff so much, but okay, on the topic of economies, right? How do you get an economic system to change? There has to be something that forces it to change, right? So when there is an economic stress or a disaster, the system changes to, in a sense, maintain this idea of a homeostasis or sameness, right? Now, I do know there was one guy that talked about this long time back. It was some guy. He's the guy that wrote the Black Swan and the Anti-Fragile thing. Nassim Nicholas Taleb. Yeah, that guy. I definitely have my disagreements with him, but I remember that was one of the first times, like, at least as a kid, hearing about that. Like, oh, like, okay, yeah, there's somebody that's thinking about this hormesis and stress response thing to economies. And I think he actually specifically said the word hormesis when he was writing about it. And so my point is what are the things that you can experience that induce a change? That's, I guess, in the most kind of big picture way I could phrase this, is any moving system with moving parts or whatever, how do you induce change? An identity that remains during the change.
Equals MA. Flows. And so it's like the policy is like the top-down lever that you can engender on a system. Like, for instance, like a cell if it's like the policy is like, I want you to die, that's like apoptosis, like,
Apoptosis, yeah.
like, that is like strategic, like, maybe it's like a cell that doesn't need to exist anymore because it's like not efficient. And I mean, like, that's a
Synaptic
similar
pruning
thing.
in a sense.
Right. It's
Cooper's
like the pruning of in our current society, kind of indiscriminately, I might add, is sort of like, imagine if like the brain was sending signals to like a body that it didn't understand, because the body was more complex than it could even fathom, and it didn't really like, it was sort of like the brain wouldn't die no matter what decision it made. So it's like societies can form where like the brain, or rather the policy centers of the system, are so abstracted away from like the thing keeping the whole system alive on the long term, that like you can like be pressing the nuclear code button and then sort of, the nukes go off, but the brain is still like, oh, we're fine here, to give like a colorful metaphor. And it's like, I think like, if you're thinking about systems change, like what systems do you want to have change? Like, should everyone work to death? Like, should everyone not have healthcare, right? Like, what systems should exist and what are the obstacles to get them to exist? Or like more superstructural things, like for instance, the ramifications of slavery, or sort of like, what about all of these people with great ideas for creating a more, I guess, like utopic structured society, but they're never given positions of power to actually influence that. Like, there's this equilibrium state that is at every scale that like prevents change, and then the change comes from like very small segments of the entire system, and there's only so much that can happen internally to actually guide that.
Yeah. Yeah. And the other thing that I think about too, so I'm sure I mean, in a way you could say you sort of change things and adapt to avoid a kind of paradox or a disagreement. Like maybe Misha could speak to this, considering he is and studying to be a lawyer. But when you or just sort of in general, right? If something needs to be changed, are you changing, or are you changing the thing around you? So it's like if I have you know if I have an illness or an injury or something, do I get my body to change that, or do I go to something in the environment that I used to change that? Or if okay, let's just say
Neither/both.
Yes, it's both. And so I could say, I think I have this disagreement with the world, right? And how do you alleviate that disagreement or that paradox of perspective? Do I change, or do I make the world change into my image? And so a lot of the times when we're interacting with the world, right, like when we see a set of objects and we're trying to build it, we think, no, these objects shouldn't be this way. Given these circumstances, we think these objects and particles should be arranged in this way, right? When I think of I actually think that's sort of also kind of the inception of tool making. So one of the things I give in presentations is also, you have a branch on a tree, branch on the ground, a branch in your hand, and a branch in a pit of fire. You're taking something that was in an existing context and switching it over to something else that you seem to be fit given your perceptual cognitive constraints, whatever, right? And it is a bias. And, a bias usually has a sort of a negative association with it, right, in the way we normally use it. But whenever you're seeing things a certain way, which is kind of what we're always doing, is it is inherently biased and limited, right? So it's like that story about the three blind men and the elephant, where they're all saying, oh, this is what it is, this is what it is. But until they all communicate and there's a network and there's some sort of invariance that's established, they're like, oh, wait, we're actually talking about the elephant. Right? So part of that is the observer has to be able to acknowledge their limitation and perspective in things. If that makes sense. I don't know.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, I got to jump off, but I guess is the question, broadly speaking, are we talking about society? We're talking about affecting change, potentially at large scale, potentially at micro scale. Is there a kind of an overarching theme to what you are really after here?
if we understand how systems change and gain some type of plasticity, right? And I mean, in brains, in hearts, in livers, in skin, in bones, in teeth, in economies, in language, in culture, and all these things. What are the common fundamental things between all of those agents of change? And how can that help us do more and reach the goals that we're interested in? Because yeah, to take a sense, we kind of have to take a goal as our perspective. For me, I see this plasticity and adaptability thing, the same thing as the hormesis stressors and all of that. Because in a sense, you have to have, you're basically saying there is a sense of a deficit or a gap to fill in order to do something, right? When you're taking a limited perspective and you're observing something and you're saying what something is, you're automatically taking a deficit of the whole because you're not seeing the whole thing, right? When it's like the Necker cube paradox. That's why that's the logo of Ekkolápto, is because there are all these different ways you can see that cube that are technically equally correct, but it depends on what you want to do with that. It depends on your goal and the perspective you're trying to take. All right, so a lot of people will see, all right, the cube is switching in 3D, which is also interesting that you're seeing a 2D thing in 3D and experiencing that way. But also, how many people can see the cube entirely as a flat object and it's like a square with a diamond around it, right? And so I think that
It's not a diamond around it. It's more like a paper, like folded on the corner, like a dog.
Yeah, it's got the angle things, whatever. See, this is perspective, right? But my thing is a lot of the ways that, I guess the way that we construct in our own internal models of the world and interact are kind of inherently subject to the limitations of our perspective. And I think part of what plasticity does is it tries to either get you to switch to a new perspective and ignoring the old one, or intersect them and combine them.
So it's almost like you're using plasticity as in something that prevents a fixation on one of the perspective or vantage points, and move towards a more holistic. What is the whole possibility space? What is the complete picture that things can be looked at? There's the preferences or the lopsidedness.
Yeah. I guess that would
which
be the
maps
way
claim absolution versus which are useful in what scenarios relatively.
Well, it's like, if you're in a
up.
situation where you need to have food, if someone's ever been like desperately hungry, right? This would be a fun thing to try, but you're desperately hungry, whatever. But when you are desperately hungry or something, you will try, your mind as this cognitive system will try to find as many things to fill that gap. So it's going to reinterpret the environment in terms of food. Maybe, maybe I don't have a pizza available. Maybe I'll eat a napkin or a piece of paper. That's still fiber. Do you remember what I'm talking about? You guys know what I'm talking about. They know exactly what
and like,
I will not confirm nor deny what you're talking about.
And like, why are those selection things? Like, why is there such an inclination just to designate a face, when there isn't one? Like, that just conveys a lot of information for that organism,
Yeah.
So
I don't know.
Are you pushing for a certain kind of equipotentiality across different possible directions and cognitive sort of attitudes? And is that what you're saying? Is that you see that as a general good to maintain a certain kind of non-commitment to any particular perspective, or are you wondering whether in certain circumstances it might be beneficial to be able to jump perspectives, and how to do that, or I guess those are related. So are those accurate? Is it you kind of?
It's like saying, it's like don't prejudge people. Right? It's sort of, in a lot of ways, in sort of a warm, emotionally satisfying thing. You're kind of saying, like, don't try to, actually, people in meditation and advanced practice, they talk about this, about seeing the thing in a state that's less judged. And so then you can choose which perspective you want to take. And you're aware of the fact that you're taking the perspective and using certain constraints to do that. I actually do think that again, I don't know if agnosia is the exact way I would describe this whole thing, but I think especially people that are very intense advanced meditators, which some of our mutual friends and people on here would talk about maybe on another episode. And then also people that are, go into those cessation meditation states, whatever they are, where everything kind of shuts off and they come back into it, and then they can sort of see things. They would say that they see things for as they are. Now, you're always taking a limited perspective, but maybe it's less so in comparison. And so if you're seeing things a little bit more vaguely, like the Necker cube illusion, you sort of gain awareness of the fact that you are taking the perspective. So a lot of it is just sort of that metacognitive thing of the fact that you are taking a limited perspective on something, whether it is correct or not.
So just to play devil's advocate, and I do have to jump off in 5 minutes. I in general would say, well, look, people tend to have sort of functional fixedness, whatever you want to call it, tend to be sort of locked in. Why would we assume that that's suboptimal? If greater open-mindedness is functionally preferable in some way, why wouldn't it be more ubiquitous? And so why would you assume that? I mean, maybe it's something you have an aesthetic preference for, or in certain circumstances you see that has certain functionality. But is it possible that being too open-minded in some, or if to use that term, has functional that it actually can be less functional, right? Can have certain that it can lead to certain suboptimalities in certain circumstances. Do we want people to always be able to adjust their perspective, or perhaps it's functional for people to be fixed on a certain perspective so that they cohere around like beliefs, right? Do we want people to have patriotism or religious beliefs or these kinds of things in a firm, a very convicted way, high conviction? Is high conviction generally negative? Is it right sociologically negative? And so I want to just raise that as a possible potential pushback, not to be a pain in the ass, but because, well, we have to be open-minded about open-mindedness, right?
There you go. That's it.
Right.
So Alon's got it.
Right. So in some ways we should be open to the possibility that it, in fact, it could be suboptimal, maybe in some cases. So I think that's just an interesting, something you Addie have to kind of respond to on some level if you're looking for that agenda.
Yeah.
Yes. Jess, you want to say something before I hop in?
Oh, just furthering the point of like, it's sort of what's an abstracts what's a good way to be versus like dealing with the reality that there's like a variety of big five personality types, and like there's not a uniform, not everybody has the same mind that works exactly the same way. There is differences, and there's, for better or worse, it exists at a like species ecological level of the different niches they occupy. So like, yeah, it's all just furthering the same thing, but go ahead.
Yeah, my response, which I have somewhat erratically been crafting but already had pre-constructed, is that so this is all right. I'm excited for this. So basically, right, my perspective and understanding on this is that all of this is the nature of it is that you are always you're never seeing the whole thing, right? And even then, I can't prove that I'm never seeing the whole. It's a whole weird thing to get into. That's paradoxical, but in sort of plain speak, you would say it depends on the goal, right? So if you have a company, for instance, right? If everyone is off doing their own thing and there is no shared contract of agreement towards the goal and the perspective to have, right? Because you can have slightly different perspectives, right? It's the same sort of hormesis curve. There's a sweet spot in the middle. You want just the right amount of different perspectives and change in noise to hold the system accountable. It's like with your body, if it's never forced to do that change, it can't sustain itself, whatever, right? And so, the example of a company is one of the reasons that I think companies are basically, universities, labs, they're, in a lot of ways, they borrow a lot of the same cognitive properties of religions and cults, but they're maybe using it in a positive way. right? When you are studying a certain thing, you're taking a certain lens and shared agreement of doing something when you work with someone. If everyone in a company, for instance, whatever it is, all has completely different thoughts and they can't ever reach some shared conclusion, it doesn't exist, right? So, and it's like also when people talk about with cancer, is that cancer is like a high agency, proto-organism in your body that's competing for the resources that everything else is, is coordinated to work towards, right? And also you could think of this in a bigger way. It's like, well, if you look at just the idea of an organism from the perspective and lens of, say, the environment or the ecosystem, if you look at, I'll put it to you this way: your body has, not a human body, but an organism has to take a certain lens and limited shared perspective to survive in the water. Right. And we know that because your cells and everything will adapt, will try to adapt to those changes, try to induce that kind of plasticity. Right. But, being in water is not necessarily going to transfer well to being, up on the air. So this also begs another question about this idea of far transfer and task learning and everything, is that, are there things that are almost anti-transfer, which also goes to what Misha was talking about yesterday with us about, again, you're taking that certain lens of learning that thing or whatever, and then that's hiding something else because of that limited perspective, right? And so I guess my answer is that yes, there is a sweet spot to this, it would seem, right? And I can sort of, again, paradoxically go and say, is what I'm saying right now by agreeing with this also limited? But for sake of our conversation, I would agree with that and say yes, there is a sweet spot. Just as with the hormesis thing, I look at this as the same sort of generating thing. I think actually touching on a similar thing with autoregression, just in a different way. And I think that part of what we're trying to go for is reaching that sweet spot. But there has to be something for you to change to reach that sweet spot, right? So yes, okay. I agree that there has to be a sweet spot, and too much change and not enough change is a bad thing from the perspective of the observer.
You could also agree that it's going to be very context dependent, right? I mean, it's like in an organizational setting, you don't want, you're about to go into the NBA championship, and you're the captain of the team. You really don't want to be considering the possibility that there's another perspective here. The other team also has pretty good players and maybe deserves to win. There really needs to be a locked in. This is the way the world should work, and everybody else is wrong. And
yeah,
and so it really is. So I wonder, you might have to try to speak to where you're the sweet spot for what sweet spot and for what situation, and speak elaborate more on that. In order to really ground this, to be able to, and maybe there's a function there, right? Maybe you could actually describe some sort of loosely mathematical function in that you could have this degree of malleability and open to different perspectives under conditions of the level of competition, or I don't know what, but I think you need to say more than just say that there's a sweet spot in order to actually be able to try to pursue, what you're talking about, which is programs or practices that maybe can get you
right
there.
I do have a response to this, and the first thing that I will put up is that, is the organism in competition with the environment, or in sort of a mutual partnership, or is it in competition? Is it in competition, or is it working with the environment? I would say that it's actually a bit of both, right? Because in an environment, an ecosystem, you have to, if you say, animals and plants or whatever are living, and you attribute some level of agency or cognition or whatever to them, all right, yeah, you are making a choice that's now destroying another. So the way I'm looking at this is that organisms are certain lenses of solving problems and finding problems from the perspective of the environment, of, say, the planet or whatever, right? Planet, galaxy, whatever thing that you want to use. And so the environment solves and it solves problems in the ocean by developing things like fish, but it solves problems on land by developing something like a monkey or a human or an ant or whatever, and all the different scales in the ecosystem. And each of those, when you, by saying you are a person, you are Alon, you're Alif, you're Michael, whatever, is that saying the environment has almost taken a perspective on you. It's taken a restricted perspective. And in a way, if there's a limited environment, the agents are competing for resources. But here's the kicker, right? Is if it's like the economic thing earlier, if something is taking things from the environment more quickly than it's able to put it back out into the environment to sustain the environment, the whole thing falls, right? If I'm in a limited ecosystem, which in our case we are, right? We have a limited kind of a relationship with that. If I have, I'll put it to you this way: if I have a bunch of apples, or let's just say I've planted some grains or something or whatever on the ground in a farm. If I go and I take all of those grains, all of those fruits or vegetables, and there's no way for it to continue in the future, not only does the environment fall apart, but I also fall apart because now I have nothing to sustain myself in the future. So in a lot of ways, it's saying don't be selfish. You have to think of yourself across different scales in space and in time. And the other person I've heard talk about, I think Levin has a specific word he asked for this that's slipping me at the moment. But this also ties into the hormesis thing, right? Where, you are competing with, an apple by eating it. But there has to be a level of a kind of shared mutual kind of respect for each other that, okay, I'm eating the apple, but I'm leaving the seed. Because then not only does the apple get to survive in a different form in the future, but then I also get to sustain myself because that'll grow into an apple that I can eat. This is how we have the modern sort of food chain of things. If you wipe out something entirely and there's nothing left, then both systems fail. So why, if you're in a partnership or relationship or whatever, and if you take, the thing falls apart on both ends. The relationship is no longer there after that. If you take up all the food, all the resources, all the energy, then there's nothing.
Yep.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, so you're talking about it at extremes, and then, but but then there's the question of the sweet spot, right? And
the sweet spot is there has to be an agreed level of exchange between the informational exchange, whatever, between the organism and the environment, the observer and the observed, right? That's.
But I guess so. Again, what I would say is, well, humans have that. They're somewhere in between, and a lot of diversity across people and where they fit. But where I think the larger agenda is to push to nudge things in a certain direction.
Yes.
And then the onus again is and again I'm just playing devil's advocate. I have the same aesthetic you do, but that doesn't mean it's right.
Yeah, please challenge me. Please challenge me. Yes,
right,
go for
right.
it.
And so you're talking about like we
this
need
is
to
hormesis and work.
Let's collectively there should be practice. Like maybe there's stuff we need to do to make people more a certain way. And again, I think the onus would be to say, well, who says that we're not optimized? Even in our diversity, like it sort of works out that this is like where people should be about, and maybe we don't need to, consciously, proactively nudge things in a different direction. Just being, almost, raising the skeptical perspective, as I like to do.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, and it's the same thing about you need to introduce a bit of noise, perturbation, or stress or whatever, to keep the thing going and growing and adapting, right? And that's what we would say as we're reaching some type of goal or whatever, right? And so it's sort of like what I was talking about yesterday or day before yesterday, with how an organism or a system has to have, each component has to have an agreement and be helpful, but also stressful in another context. Right. So part of the reason that our bodies or whatever other way that they are, is that there's a level of stress that each unit is putting on each other, but it's a shared level of that sort of perturbation or stress or whatever. And so that it's for that reason that, if for instance, your heart is having an issue, how much of that is outsourced while the heart is having an issue to other organs? Right? It's like, in fact, you could also say that this is why certain like symmetries in the body and even asymmetries are developed, because let's say, you have an injury in your right arm and you're right-handed, right? So a lot of people, you know, they'll hurt their wrists or their arm or whatever, and then their thing's in a cast, and now they have to learn how to use their left hand, right? And so that's also an example of a different type of plasticity. So the thing with this is you have to induce the observer and the agent to change, right? And so there should always be something present, whether it's sort of minimal. Again, you don't want something too small or too large. You want the sweet spot. And I can give you maybe specific examples depending on the situation. But you always want to have some bit of noise in that system. Something that's keeping it slightly uncertain, something that's keeping it on its toes, right? Mm-hmm. And you know, I can say that for the brain, it's that, you know, for our definition and measure of good brain health, it seems to be somewhat agreed that you want to always kind of challenge it. You know, I think learning to play different musical instruments at a high technical, skill level will have that effect, or learning new languages or whatever. And what do we see happens when we outsource that to something outside of us? Well, that starts to atrophy in ourselves, right? I think, you know, it's the example that I always bring up is with calculators and GPS or whatever. It's like, okay, well, you know, at one point, you know, we need to rely on our own sort of spatial skills to get around in a sort of in a map in an area, right? And then we invented maps and all those things, which in a way you could argue that did that lessen our memory capability over time? Maybe, maybe not. And then with GPS, now you don't even necessarily have a need to learn that as much. You need to have a little bit, but not as much as you would have had to before, right? And then the other thing is also with calculation. At one point, we had literal human calculators. A calculator was a human. Right? Yeah, we had the abacus and all that type of stuff, but humans were still doing the calculating, right? Mm-hmm. And now it's shifted much over. We've almost outsourced that kind of intelligence or agency or control over to say, you know, the calculators on our computers and phones. Right? But the relationship works as long as that tool that you're outsourcing to is always present. So in our brain, right, when we have different parts of the brain or different parts of the body, is that whatever we're taking in as energy or fuel also supports that. So in a weird kind of sense, like, you know, the things the calculator uses and the things your brain uses for energy are two different things. And if they were replenished in the same way, you could basically make an argument that they're a part of the same organism or system, right? And so that also reminds me of like when I have trained on certain types of cognitive skills, memory skills, whatever, is I would notice I'd be more reliant on, more dependent on some type of specific visual memory training that I was doing, and I would not be able to tap into the older one as much, even though they both had their purposes. And so the ways of inducing the plasticity that lets you keep both of those perspectives to choose from is you kind of have to pulse those differences. Is you don't get too locked into one thing too much. You have to induce that change and switching of things, right? And so people that are very successful that have, you know, multiple jobs, they run multiple companies, have different positions in different organizations, is sometimes they'll say, there's different parts of the day where I just lock into one thing and then I completely shift over to another thing. And it's pulsing throughout the day in these different ways. Mm-hmm. You know, maybe Monday is company X, Wednesday is company Y, Friday is company Z. And you're pulsing that. Because it's sort of like when we try to multitask, it kind of ruins our productivity in one specific task. Yeah. Is this clicking together at all? I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, I mean, a lot of like in and out of flow states and time blocking stuff. But at a broader level, yeah, like the goodness of being able to pulse in and out and not being locked in, and sort of the being in one state too long creates, you know, deterioration of the overall stuff. Yeah, like
yeah. And I think there's other things that have that going on that we don't even usually think about. And the example I give for that is that vision thing I was telling you about the other day with the hormesis and the brain thing, where it's that if you, for example, if you introduce a loss of information to your visual system in your brain, and that original goal is maintained of trying to maintain a coherent picture, it will try to fill in the gaps, right? Like, okay, another example that you can literally try right now is, have you seen those images where you look at something in color and then it very quickly switches to like a black and white thing, and there's a level of transfer between the existing color perception onto the black and white? Well, the point that I wanted to bring up is that there are different types of changes that you can make that leads to transfer and then leads to less transfer and then anti-transfer, right? And it depends on the type of change that you're making. And, the change at what level, right? As I say, like, to be a good communicator, like when you're writing an email, is you have to be able to maintain and switch between the perspectives of when you're looking at it with fresh eyes and when you just wrote it. Because when you just write it, you're able to edit and modify it. But when you look at it with fresh eyes, you're able to see how the other person is going to see it. And the goal of the email you're writing is so that the other person can also interpret it the way you want them to. So I also think very good communicators, designers, or whatever, have maybe some sort of innate ability, whatever, but it's trainable. But they have the sort of ability to switch between those perspectives and think in those ways.
Right.
Yeah.
I even said, like, there's sort of it's sort of reiterating what you're saying, like, and going all in on them too. Like, there's every now and then I see the David Bowie clip saying about how, like, an artist does his best work when he's not trying to appease other people.
I know
really,
exactly
really,
what you're talking about.
really
Yes.
commits to it,
Yeah.
right? But then it's like you have to do that, but then do what you're talking about too. Like, you have to go and then go to the edge. Get your feet wet in the water and be a little bit uncomfortable, that kind of stuff. That clip. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Anyone have any just very specific criticisms or things that just did not make any sense or were not even remotely valuable? Like, just any criticism, anything at all.
It's not so much a criticism as, like, sympathy for the discussion, because what we're saying sounds great, but it's like the work is conveying why, like,
Right.
like what's the point of it, and the implicit bigger narrative critique of, or bigger narrative, like, kind of, I think I was gonna kind of bridge this to what Elon said earlier, but basically, we may be in a world where there's a heavy precedence for certain specialization and optimization at large. So when there's so much pressure, and even not to be nefarious and like, big evil conspiracy about, whatever in the world, well, like why are there pressures towards, you can say lack of plasticity if you want to, but towards the specialization and let's just stop and just keep doing what we're doing kind of a deal. Like articulating against all of those different pressures is, or like the NBA finals reference too, like figuring out how to talk about this relative to, like, a context, relative to, growth and health, relative to all these other things. I think it's the shape of the conversation changes depending on that, but it is still the same. I think there is something coherent you are addressing.
Okay.
But
okay.
If it's one thing, like in a functional sense, are you trying to, like, write papers about this? Are you trying to use this as means to get someone to buy a product? Like what are you trying to do with that, as far as exploring the idea? That's a whole other set of conversations.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, I don't know. Passing
I
thoughts.
guess the way I would have summed it up before the others had left is that I'm trying to sort of establish a formalism for the things that induce change in a system that are say a beneficial change, because there are adaptations you can have that some would argue are maladaptive or whatever. And it's like, what is a beneficial change in a system? And my kind of perspective on this is that by taking a broader approach to understanding diverse forms of moving systems like this, is it lets you just do more, right? So when I think of these things, I think about, okay, if I think of this in these bigger picture ways, how does that let me induce change in, say, skin or hair or the eyes or the brain or the teeth or whatever? But then also, how much does that sort of idea also transfer over to maybe how do I want to understand maybe how real estate works, and what are the right decisions to make in real estate or in buying land, or whether I should go to, I should fly to this place or fly to this place, or maybe, should I do this task or this task today? What's worth my time? So in a lot of ways, maybe I'm just sort of getting to some type of decision theory, game theory thing in my own weird way. I think in a lot of ways, that's kind of what I was going for, is like, in order to have something beneficial, what are the right things to do to reach that? Because beneficial at what scale?
Right.
I can eat, a donut right now and feel all good, but if I keep doing that for years, I may have a problem, right? And so there's things that seem like they're good in the short term, but are bad in the long term. And if you remember from yesterday, I was also saying that there may be things that seem like they're bad in the short term, but are good in the long term.
So yeah, and like I'm kind of, I think there's a complete other side of the coin, which is like the direction that you want to go in. Like a lot of what sets the parameters for if it's useful or not is like, where do you want to go? And
For
that's
right now, biology.
yeah. What I mean, like, I meant like broad, not just you, but like in general. But yeah.
Right. Yeah, and this was helpful after a conversation from the other day about kind of finding what are the more important things that me or Ekkolápto or whatever should be focusing on and dedicating time towards. Yeah, I mean, one thing that I'll talk about on the next one, the time perception one, is how different organs and systems in the body perceive time and how that relates to, say, aging. Right? Is I think part of the aging thing is that you need to be able to change. I think if you really want to have some sort of organism that lives a long time, it has to live in a way that it has to basically live in harmony with its environment. Is right. So there is if you have too many long living people, how is that going to sort of remove certain beneficial dynamics in an ecosystem or whatever? And in a lot of ways, maybe a current analogy for that are old Toyotas or Hondas that still keep running really well to this point, and it's that if something works, you don't need to change it, right? If it ain't broke, you don't fix it, as that's kind of a consensus that people have, right? And so, yeah, if the system is able to maintain sameness across that change, right, as a sort of a different type of adaptation, then you would say, all right, then it's successful or whatever, right? And my thing for longevity and back to the time perception thing and plasticity is I would be curious to see if we can find a good way to measure how different parts of the body can experience time in their own way, because we can say the brain does. It wouldn't be a stretch to say the heart kind of has its own way of telling time. We know that circadian and ultradian rhythms affect all sorts of different things in the body. So I would imagine there may be a good chance that, the whole body has this internal clock, which it would seem that it has to function and kind of coordinate with the time of day and everything that's going on in the world or whatever. And how can you kind of take that and control it towards something that's beneficial for longevity, right? And I would be interested to see not just speeding it up or slowing it down, but how are you speeding it up and slowing it down in what way? Right, because remember I was saying earlier in the conversation about how your perception of time changes throughout the day depending on what's happening. And maybe there's certain things you want for a liver or heart to experience time slower in one context, but maybe experience it faster in the other. That would be beneficial towards something. So tomorrow's will be kind of about ways of sort of entraining biological, internal clocks. So I'll start off with talking about the practice of guessing the time and then move on to other things. But I would sum up that a lot of the things that I'm sort of in the short term focused on is sort of cognitive and biological enhancement, right? I guess that really is the way I would sum it up.
Those weird visual illusions that you can watch to actually like trigger, similar to that color transfer thing. There's ones where you can like get weird moving images in your visual field.
Yeah.
It's
again, and it's just fascinating that is possible. And then my immediate reaction to that is, okay, if it's doing that in the brain, what else in the body can you have a similar effect on, right?
Mhm.
So yeah, tomorrow's is going to be a little bit more on that type of stuff, which I'm actually a little bit more interested in talking about. But yeah, no, I these conversations are definitely, they're helpful for me to kind of work out the kinks in the way I think about things and the way I explain it and all of that. And then obviously I get to hear what other people have to think and as well. And if you notice, like I really do try to prompt people to like throw a wrench in. Like, you know, now after this today, I'm going to kind of analyze this and be like, all right, well, you know, I think my interpretation of this is that I think I may have lost some people along the way, and I could do a better job at maybe, you know, explaining things and rephrasing things in a way that's a bit more, you know, understandable. And it's important. It is sort of that learning process. It's sort of like to Michael Ostroff when we were filming your video a while back on metric ambiguity, is like it's at the end of the day, I think we want to be right. We want to have something that works or whatever that means. And so I actually kind of feel a thrill when somebody throws a wrench in, because it's like, okay, boom, maybe that's an opportunity to get that much closer. So I don't know if that's always the most conducive to a good conversation amongst multiple people. But I definitely think I have a kind of favor and bias towards people throwing wrenches into what I have to say.
Yeah, I mean, I've been in similar kind of conversations like this before about kind of adjacent topics, and I think it's good to do that. And also, like, I'm going to drop a link in here for like embodied intelligence,
Right.
which is a conference that I really like and I've been at a few times. And like, it might be nice to get some language from, like, you know, even like control theory or developmental stuff or like old school cybernetics things. Like there's a lot
Right.
there. It's just, it tends not to be popular, and a lot of interdisciplinary communication around these topics are kind of really, you know, like if you had like someone from hardcore complexity science, like Santa Fe Institute stuff, they would have, you know, probably their own school of thought about certain things and how we talk about these kind of changes,
Right.
versus like the control theory or the self-robotics people or the people that are trying to do like, you know, developmental things that are relating to the body and so on. So it's like, I have a lot of sympathy and interest in it, and I personally like your approach to it. And it mirrors some of the conversations I've had. Like we've had some similar conversations about this, albeit maybe slightly more. Like we did a whole deep dive on like certain branches of like phenomenology and like Francisco Varela
Right.
and the whole path that way too in or my other lab and stuff like that. So it is I think it's a worthy discussion, and I think you're trying to ground it in the right stuff, and I'm curious to see where it goes, because I think it's certainly a literacy I'd like to see more of in the world. Like that this should be something that's a little bit more accessible than it necessarily is, you know, but it'll have its challenges to do that. So yeah.
Yeah, and the kind of meta point that I wanted to bring up to this is it's also like when someone's throwing a wrench in as a stressor to the conversation, right? Is that if it's too much of a stressor or a wrench, then the sort of it stalls, the engine stalls, right? The
Right.
whole thing kind of stops. So when you try to introduce a disagreement or you know, to throw a wrench in somebody's argument, is the way, if you want to keep the dynamic of the conversation going, you have to do it in small doses, distributed throughout it in a certain way.
Yeah, and it's a bit like if you ever watch. I don't play a lot of D&D, but like I'm a big fan of Critical Role, and it's sort of like Critical Role's a D&D, like, you know, YouTube show, whatever, and it's sort of a similar thing. Like, are you having actors that or characters or participants in the discussion that want the conversation to kind of reach the heights that it can do? And there's sort of like the rule of cool. Like if something's a nice idea, even though it's wacky, are you going to entertain it and try to extract some of the draw from it to let it play out? Versus like, you know, people just kind of, you know, you can be antagonistic. You can be someone who's like, well, I think I don't like this person and your ideas. Let's just go off the rails. And, you know, there's sort of a mutual social approach that makes it work when people want to do it. you know. So there's sort of that community aspect.
There's something to be said for giving people access to the territory of idea space they otherwise not had access to with their whole repertoire of history and perspectives that they have onto certain things. And if you find people that are genuinely willing to explore this idea space with the tools they have from their histories, that's where you get the really fun stuff, I find.
Yeah. And I'm particularly very fascinated with the means by which you facilitate that as a guide or and people trying to do like I think that's like how do you actually do innovation in the world like in a way that's most needed? It's about that, like especially with considering diversity of experiences that are underrepresented, especially even domains of knowledge that aren't really integrated. So like absolutely, and then like plus 100,000, you know, infinite whatever. Yeah, big time.
Yeah. Would you, just considering our conversation for the last couple conversations that we've had and things that we've covered, right, is I'm trying to figure out, should I attribute a sort of name to my big picture theory and idea of things? Because in a lot of ways, and I spoke about this with people earlier, but it's like, you know, in a lot of ways, I think all of us are trying to make our own theories of everything in our own ways to model the world and understand it and get by or whatever. And it just depends how much we want to do. And it's like, I don't want to call it that. I mean, I think I am trying to going into that territory with the amount of types of systems that I'm trying to consider. But I am trying to think about like what would be the right way to phrase this to people. Like, is this sort of my take on a theory of information or something, right? Or a theory of agency, right? A theory of agency and dynamics or something like that, right? Because when I think about
information processing.
Yeah, like when I think of I try to tie together simple things like a conversation and then perception and things in math and language and a little bit in physics and things in the arts and design and environments and economies and all these different things. And I try to find a lens that I can form that lets me look at all of those as one system that's all connected, and that, you know, by modifying these parts, it affects this thing and whatsoever. And I guess this is sort of a theory of information and agency, maybe a theory of informational agency or something like that, about how different.
I mean, this goes back, like this is sort of like a very modern take on old school cybernetics.
Correct.
And like, I'm not saying to discredit, is like I don't. Yeah. It's so tough because it's challenging because all the specializations we deal with are these kind of siloed domains, you know, and there's very little incentive to get sort of the foundational materials to talk about what you want. So it's sort of like it is a dilemma, and I don't have a right answer, but I think, you know, in the short term, I think finding something that's coherent to you and accessible that at least speaks to the audience. You're gonna basically, I think sort of the functional, like Machiavellian answer is, who are you most interested in talking to about it, and what are they going to understand? I mean, that's not really that's not really an answer either, you know. So, but yeah, like I think there is something there, and I think it's I'll show you sometime soon. I wrote an essay about like vantage points and the difficulty of making a new vantage point relative to old ones, and you can kind of, you know, guess. I won't go into here, but like there's sort of this requisites scaffolding, you know, of it all, and you're going to kind of have to just pick a point and build out from it, even though it's attached to nothing, but then work to translate back to like the existing structures. And all I can say is I'm really interested in the process. I don't in one sense, I don't think it matters what you make it, like even the term cybernetics was this weird ass term that people just made because it meant, like, you know, steering the ship, and had this reference that, like, it was sort of a term that was just made. And obviously cybernetics is really anachronistic, and it almost has a bad connotation now, although it has a little bit of hype recently. But it's like, you know, I don't have a great suggestion. I think it'd be something that you will just decide, and then it'll probably change a lot the more that you actually build it out. and that's okay too.
Yeah, hopefully it does change and things are being done. I mean, I think admittedly part of my problem too as well is that I've said this before publicly, right? That like I actually try to not consume the same information that other people are consuming, so that I can sort of look at something in a very different way and see what else is kind of there that maybe other people haven't picked up on because of the lens that they were taking to interact with that information. And like I kid you not, like I sometimes get more ideas and inspiration from looking at like a flower or a cloud in the sky or like some weird abstract painting than I do from reading a paper. Don't get me wrong, reading papers and articles, very helpful and great, very thankful for it, awesome. But also for whatever reason, I just seem to have a just, you know, a sort of tendency to be able to better be inspired by just really sort of random, ambiguous things. Right? Like I don't actually read that much. I think a lot. I think and I observe things in my everyday world. Like normal interactions. When I go to the store to buy a thing of water, I'll think very wildly about that. Right? That's basically been my process throughout my life for coming up with these types of things. And part of that was sort of this risk and experiment that I was taking. And it's like, I wonder if I sort of come at things from a completely different angle, how much of it converges with other things that were studied more traditionally.
Right.
Right? Because, you know, this current structure we have of understanding the world, yeah, in an abstract sense, these structures have always been there in some form, but it's like, oh, are you you know, an information theorist? Are you a rationalist following the free entry principle? Are you interested in Wolfram physics? Or are you interested in string theory? Like, you have this sort of school of thought, and I sort of was like, well, what if I kind of ignored that and tried something else, just sort of very different in my own way?
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's like, I haven't gone as far as I wanted to go, but like if you look at the history, like there's a great conversation about this. I think it's the first episode of the Complexity Explorer podcast by Santa Fe Institute with Krakauer and like Michael Garfield or somebody, and they talk about what's like, your point is extremely important, and I think the majority of all the training I've ever been exposed to, unless it's specifically interested in like philosophy and history of science or ideas and things like that, it doesn't really give any. It presents something like it's just, well, here's how we do it, and it really undersells the immense challenges of developing things, even like in a Thomas Kuhn, you know, standard science and the, you know, structure of scientific revolutions things, like getting, even which has, you know, its use as a concept, but like getting to a specific stage of quote unquote normal science that has established paradigms that can be challenged, and then, you know, revolution. But a lot of things, and a lot of important things, are in sort of these pre-scientific stages that don't have coherency, that don't have a lot of people working on it, that don't have a mutual language around it yet. So it's like understanding, like, wait a second, like, and I actually find this to be some of the most inspiring things of all, because it's understanding that, yeah, not everything's solved yet. Not everything is actually like perfected and finished. There's narratives and trajectories to development, but, you know, there's reasons why inertia of certain fields and siloed information have developed in certain ways, and empiricism and all these movements that are very, very important. But also, like, I think what you're trying to do is also, I kind of feel a little weird saying first principles thinking, but sure, first principles thinking, or just that process of understanding that just because there's been essentially a path dependency of choices in how things have developed, even to very minute or very narrow, specific, highly synthetic and detailed fields of study, doesn't mean that we have to stay locked into those paths as they've developed. Is that kind of?
Yeah, I agree with this. And another personal story I was going to give for this is that when I was younger, especially, like, because of the trouble I'd have recognizing things or whatever, right? Is like, you know, if I was eating something, I would kind of have to look around and be like, okay, what can I use to eat this thing? do I use my hands to eat this? Is there a way I can move the plate to do this? Oh, there's this thing that's a fork or a spoon, and it looks like it might be able, when I run the simulation in my head, it looks like it might be able to hold up the food and do whatever. And then, oh, I can do that. But I would also, like, I remember one time I had like some straws or something, and I tried to make my own weird utensil to eat food, right? Like, it's the goal is kind of more of the universal thing rather than the instantiation or path for the goal, right? So the path, if you're trying to eat a meal that's on your table or whatever, the end goal is the same, to eat your food. But are you eating it with a fork or a spoon or spork or chopsticks, or with your hands or through some other thing, whatever, right? You could also say, like, when we cook foods, we process them, we ferment them, we're externalizing our digestion and our metabolism, right? In a lot of ways, when we eat, when we take, when we have an animal or whatever, if it's a cow and have, the ruminant digestive system, whatever, and the way it's processing the grass, you could say we're indirectly eating and interacting with the grass in the way that system was interpreting the information, and then we just chunk that. So a lot of the way I think about digestion and all that is that it's just the way you're chunking that information, right?
Well, I mean, go ahead. Sorry.
No. I mean, I'm going off on a damn tangent again. But my point with this is that, yeah, when I was younger, when this agnosia, whatever it was a bit more intense, is that I was always looking at things like new for the first time, or at least a lot of the time. And so I would try to have to be like, okay, well, what can I use to do this task? So I would be focused on the broader goal rather than a specific path, right? Like, if you want to go to sleep, you don't have to only sleep on one position in the bed. You can sleep in different areas. You could sleep at the ground. You could sleep on a chair. Maybe you can make something to sleep on that's around you. I think a lot of the things that are happening when you get to, and this is sort of the tunnel vision, not stressed enough system type of thing, where it gets tunnel vision. The system, society gets tunnel vision, right? Like, right now, I think there's tunnel vision for AI for a lot of people. I love AI. It's absolutely incredible. Do not get me wrong. I am a supporter of AI. I want to make sure that's very clear with people. But what I'm saying is that that's just another form of a type of intelligence. Is there something else out there that could do even more that we haven't considered exploring? And I don't think we're going to reach this thing that's going to be able to kind of figure out everything that's there or ever was. I think we're always kind of inherently limited in our understanding of things for whatever reason. And we'll find that there is going to be certain ways, certain paths of taking things that have their own benefits, right? If you have the fork and spoon in front of you and there's nothing else, that's going to be the most easiest way for you to eat your foods if you don't want to use your hands or the plate, right?
To much to your point, I remember going to a conference some years ago about deep learning will save us, and just this, even in the sense that old school debates about artificial intelligence means XYZ. No, it means machine learning. No, it means deep learning, and they're all even we didn't say this yesterday, but we're talking about architectures and whatnot like that. Even a von Neumann architecture, or these architectures for really deep core computational processing. There are differences in those things too, and I think we're in an era where there's just a lot of the pressure to specialize for someone to how you think about something and to how to survive and get a job about it is very strong in this time right now.
Right.
And it's sort of this weird. We kind of talked about the internet stuff before about there's this juxtaposition that there's immense pressure to specialize to certain things, but there's also this huge wave of opportunity in internet and niche things and fleshing out the possibility spaces of experiences and knowledge domains and the space between them and all that stuff. So it's a very, a lot of chaos there and things not all moving in the same direction for sure.
Yeah, I do think that I don't know if everyone else maybe agrees with this or not, but there is, I think this is a special time. I think every generation has its special moments for sure, but I think with the current cultural climate towards things just in economics, politics, religion, science, whatever, everything that's happening with our technology and the way things have been going and look like they're going to be going this seems to be I think this is something we're going to look back on, with like complete awe that this all is happening now. And I think that whenever I see that there is and again, this is almost sort of just the idea of competition and decision or whatever. It's like, okay, you see there's a deficit somewhere. If there's a deficit, that means there is something to do, right? So it's like what we were talking about with the funding thing, right? About, okay, if a bunch of funding is being cut, there is a deficit of the original reference point of the system, which basically means it had something that it was accustomed to, and now it's no longer there, and that needs to be filled and changed in some way. And, if you look at the ways, like through end of symbiosis and all these different things that happen in biology, but also other, dynamical systems that we know of, is that there's different ways those holes are filled and those gaps are bridged. And sort of a real world grounded example of this is, I think, when you have something where there is an existing structure, like all the science funding currently that's now kind of being pulled back, right? Is what does that lead to? Do we have the freedom to choose if that means disaster or if that actually makes us stronger and we come up with something even better? My thing in life is that if you want to be successful and survive, is you have to look at everything as a stimulus to get better. And you can get very obsessive about this, but I have noticed that the more kind of generally successful people that I have met, whether or not they have a formalism for it or not, they have this kind of mindset where no matter what happens, it's just a stimulus to do better and change and grow. Right. And so it's like, let's just say in my life, okay, I wasn't able, let's say I had something I wanted to go and speak for, or had this event or whatever, and let's say something didn't work out that I was attending. Well, guess what? Now I'm going to try to not only, make up for that, but overcompensate. I'm going to throw my own event. It's going to be the best one. It's going to do even more than the other one, and I'll get all competitive or whatever. And I think that's just what dynamical systems are doing in various degrees of agency. I wouldn't say, a car has the same agency as a human or anything like that, but that is the way that we kind of fill those deficits and those needs, right? And so going back again to the science funding thing in terms of this modern world problem that we have today, is I wonder if there's going to be other organizations that are similar in spirit to like this Ekkolápto thing that are going to be like, all right, we're going to think of really unconventional, low-cost ways of solving these problems, right? Like you have to think about a moment for something like placebo and the effect that can have on people. Like I part of the reason that I wasn't ready to be more public about this with the pain perception thing is wait a minute, if you can just kind of train, not really for much added cost, if you could train on you're using a painkiller, whatever, it doesn't even have to be a pill. It could be anything for alleviating the pain that you're taking, that's acting with more agency on the pain. And then it relieves itself, and you're able to create an association with that inside of your mind. And then you can call on that, just like you can call on a painful memory or a happy memory, and it'll make you feel better. If you can do that for pain, what does that mean about our industry for pain management? Right? And the reason that I also want to be careful talking about this is that there are lots of people that we would consider kind of in the woo-woo pseudoscience sphere of things that may say a similar thing. I don't think we mean the exact same thing, but it comes across similarly. And it's right. I think I want to be super, super rigorous. My immediate response to when I think about something woo, or somebody else thinks about something woo, is to be even more rigorous about it, just in case. Right. And so that's why I want to talk to people who are in these different technical fields of rigor and convey these ideas and figure out, is there something there? Because if I talk about other people that are in things that we consider to be pseudoscience, and I bring this up, is I don't know if it's going to have the same effect.
Right.
Right. So I don't know. That's where my head is at with this.
I'm 1,000,000% sympathetic to what you just said. I think you're absolutely right, because it's kind of like the conversation we had a few moments ago about the D&D table and the communication, and Cooper had a good comment about giving people the space for it. It's if you can center the conversation on dipping into that stuff that isn't some things aren't data sets for, right now. It's hard to do that kind of work to collect things that
Right.
become scientific and empirically rigorous. But like being able to dip to, and that's sort of like what's the role of these sort of potentially, existing but perhaps ineffectual or limited domains of study is like, well, there's sort of a case study right now of even like philosophically, pedagogically, the knowledge generation component of how that field of study epistemologically gets at what they're trying to get at, sure, as an example, and then doing the work to steering, or I think like this is all what it's all about to me. Like, are you willing to do the rigorous work to look at the ugliness of the inadequacies of things here and rigorously deal with those things and say, I want to make an informed decision to try to go where things haven't actually been done yet? And it's hard to do that. And it's very hard to even conceptualize what that is, because there's a lot of incentive for people not to give a damn about it.
Right.
And it certainly isn't funded, generally speaking. But it's very important, to me anyway. So.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess that kind of wraps up overall my thoughts on this, and I don't know. I you know what? Maybe tomorrow I'll wake up and I'll be like, oh nope, I'm reconsidering all this. I'm gonna start fresh again and come up with something else. And I think part of my own mental obstacles, in a sense, is I don't like being boxed in too much.
Right.
And that's why go ahead.
I see that the more I know you, the more I'm getting to know you, the more I'm like, yes. And that like your challenge will be, you will have to select for something and pick it and move it forward to go anywhere with it. However, like, that's not saying what's your role in that? Like maybe you are allostatically set at a certain point as your main space you want to be, but then you usher someone to develop the idea into a concrete thing and you let it go out. That's your role in it. I don't think you have to change yourself unless you want to be, this is my idea and my theory. I'm going to spend 5 years focused on bringing this thing out. Maybe that's what you want to do. I don't know. But like, if not, that's, I think there's sort of the conversation we're having and the meta conversation of how do we enable these things to happen and what's the best way each of us individually contributes to it too, and that's okay.
Right.
They're not going to be the same answer everywhere all the time.
Yeah. And I have noticed though that, like, in the case of like the vision stuff I was talking about yesterday, or the olfaction stuff or whatever, is that I do notice how getting to something more grounded and tangible is very helpful to it. Yeah, I feel a little constrained because I always feel about like what else is there. Like I always feel that. Like I have chronic FOMO for everything.
Right.
For ideas, for
You're gonna
going
go
places,
mad.
whatever. I know.
Try and consider all the unknown unknowns. It's an infinite fractal Z out there. Possibilities.
Yeah.
Anything's possible. With any sort of lens, you're gonna just keep finding more and more. Every question answered is just spreads out from there.
And this goes to also what Alon was saying earlier about we're talking about the sweet spot. Is there is a sweet spot to this. There's kind of this optimal zone. You don't want to be so limited that you're strictly in a tunnel thing, but you also don't want to be, as they would say, so open-minded that your head falls apart, your brain falls out, or you get this kind of FOMO thing, and you're always, you have this paralysis analysis type of thing, which I've been told that I have that many times over the years. So I very much I can see it totally.
I'm sympathetic because I have some of my close friends are that way too. But more like you need to be in the right environment for that with people who are amenable to it. I think that's kind of what you've done here. So good for you. But like, you have these conversations, people that are amenable to it, but then will give you feedback and criticism to do the complementary work of it. Because it's sort of like there's different I don't want to say roles, but there's different things people generate. Agents might generate, that further the ecology, the ecosystem of what's happening. And that's your thing. You have people that are like, some of us here are probably like the patient people that want to listen to it and think about it, and we'll think about it and come back later. Or I'll bring in this like pragmatic view about something, and Misha has obviously their very specific, expertise and approach, and they're finding outliers for this or that. It's like it's about kind of getting that group to complement you in this case as like the group leader, whatever you want to say, but also like how does the outcome be something really useful, and what ingredients are needed to kind of add to maybe you're going to have like a discussion or an arc in your life that's very exploratory, or maybe you will go down a much more concentrated path for a few years to do something specific, and that will just change what's the recipe, what's the ingredients, and what's the desired outcome all play into that too.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I can say that I do have I have two modes. If I choose to be, I can be very, very concentrated and focused.
Right.
So I have the sort of a more natural ability to get that done, and I've done it before plenty of times. That I can do. Then I have the very, very exploratory side that you're kind of seeing on salons like this too. The trick then is can you kind of balance them and tether them? That's
Right.
really what I'm trying to kind of. That's a goal that I've had for a while. That's something I think always going to be working on, because I think when you hit the sweet spot of those two extremes is when you get something that is really innovating, that actually works into the world.
Yeah.
Right. That's when you get the perfect time and place for whatever it is that you put out that gets things just right. So I think it is kind of the right balance of those things, which I'm going for.
How deep into the chaos can you go while still staying grounded?
Exactly. Right. It's like, you can
this whole talk. Yeah.
Yeah, you can keep like, I give an example, like just kind of perceptually, is that if you can keep zooming in, but if you don't have the right sort of cognitive capacity, you'll just basically forget where your starting point was. Similarly, when people get lost when they're moving around in a maze or a map, because you're only able to make sense of it if you're able to maintain the bigger picture as you're zooming in and doing more, right? So that's kind of my own weird analogy for that process.
Story of everyone's life right there.
Yep. But
Very
yeah,
big into augmentation, because obviously how we sense changes how we think, and all those patterns
Right.
and lenses we can take.
yeah. The analogy I would say, that I've said for a lot is like, it's only meters if you're using a meter stick.
Mm-hmm.
It's only an inch if you're using, if you're measuring in inches or whatever. And even then, how, when you use a ruler, how good is the ruler in the first place? And, when you think about like our reference for a gram and measurement, like these things eventually change. Yeah, maybe they change at very different timescales, but they do change. And for a while, it was a hard time about how do we get something that doesn't really change or changes much slower. So it's the idea that, the metrics are always moving, is the way I would kind of phrase it in my own way. All right. Thanks everyone for watching or listening to this. We had a kind of, as usual, quite a wide range of topics that were discussed, and somewhat chaotically, and I can only hope people were able to somehow tie them together. But thank you nonetheless. And I'll have a link to people's channels, Twitters, websites, whatever, in the description. And I'll also have the links and things that we referenced in this conversation in the description, just like we did for the last one. And make sure to like, comment, subscribe, share with people you think who may find this type of thing valuable. And I'll see you for the next one.